Evolutionary Limits, the Darwin Wallace Debate, written by David Christopher Lane, narrated by Jim Bratton. Section 1. Note to the Reader. The first part of this book includes 4 original essays by Professor David Christopher Lane on the Darwin Wallace debate, focusing on the contentious issue of whether or not natural selection can explain the human mind or soul. In Part 2, we have included the 2 original essays by Darwin and Wallace in 1858, concerning their discovery of evolution by natural selection, as presented to the Linnean Society in London, England. And in Part 3, we have incorporated a brief biography by James Marchant of Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, and their interactions with each other. Finally, the book ends with an excerpt from Alfred Wallace's questionable 1889 book, Darwinism, where he argues that the mechanisms of natural selection is ultimately limited in its application. Darwin, on the other hand, argued persuasively that natural selection could indeed explain human cognition and morality. On this crucial point, Darwin and Wallace, though still remaining friends, forever departed company. Section 2. Evolution in 4 minutes. A transcript from the film of the same name. Evolution isn't very difficult to understand, even though its implications are exceedingly important and complex. Each person is a unique pattern of information called a genome, or a living book. There are 46 chapters in our particular genome, or book, and roughly 25,000 pages that are called genes, with billions of lines of code. This code is written within molecules, or very small bits of material called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is comprised of only 4 distinct nucleotides or letters, which can be remembered by the simple acronym CTAG, CTAG. The C for cytosine, the T for thymine, the A for adenine, and the G for guanine. They get bound together in 2 long curved spaces known as a double helix. This is a model that was first discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick back in 1953, for which they won the Nobel Prize. How did I become me? In other words, why is my book of unique information written and shaped the way it is? Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace co-discovered natural selection in the mid-part of the 19th century, and it is the key mechanism behind how and why our unique genetic book is so configured. As Darwin explained in his groundbreaking study on the origin of species in 1859, if variation useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life, and from the strong principle of inheritance they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. Perhaps the simplest way to understand this mechanism of evolution is by the acronym VISITED, V-I-S-I-T-E-D. V for variation, which can occur from sexual selection and genetic mutation, etc. I for inheritance. Just as clay tablets and scrolls and codices can preserve valuable data for future generations, so too can DNA retain important information for future offspring. S is for selection, which in this case means any sieving, any process that arises in nature, ranging from competition within a species, or from without, to overpopulation, to scarcity of resources, to natural disasters. The second I simply means including, indicating that the previous 3 factors must combine with T, which stands for time. Evolution needs a period of time in order to work, and we have this in abundance given that our known universe is 13.8 billion years old, and our planet Earth is nearly 5 billion years old. The E represents equals, indicating that if you have enough variation, and a way to record such changes, and there is a winnowing process which determines winning and losing combinations, and there is enough time to play out such permutations, it will inevitably lead to D, which stands for design. We are in sum the end result of a blind watchmaker. Darwin's and Wallace's great discovery was that rich complexity can arise naturally without any intelligence guidance whatsoever. In other words, the incredible complexity we see around us and within us, from the shape of our eyes to the development of our neocortex, is the result of forces which are themselves sightless about what they will ultimately produce. This explains why our bodily mechanisms, though quite remarkable, are not perfect but rather merely good enough to survive the universe's version of the Hunger Games, to pass on their genetic inheritance. In nature's vast publishing cosmos, we are books of information that have survived millions if not billions of years of competition, where almost all tomes don't get the chance for reissues. We are successful new editions, which have yet to go out of DNA print, and thus there is immense pressure on each of us to make certain that we secure yet another publishing contract, so that our unique configuration of data doesn't get destroyed and forever lost. Perhaps it can be summarized this way: be mated or be dated. Section 3. The Darwin Wallace Debate, Natural Selection and Its Implications. I am grateful that Elliot Benjamin watched my little film on evolution, and that he has taken the time to focus on Alfred Russel Wallace's contributions to the subject of natural selection. It is one of those nice coincidences that for the past few days I have been rereading one of my favorite biographies of R. Wallace entitled The Heretic in Darwin's Court, The Life of Alfred Russel Wallace by Ross A. Sloan, New York Columbia University Press, 2004, which I highly recommend since it sheds light on many of Eliot's points. Now, the meat of Elliot Benjamin's objection to my film focuses on my inclusion of Alfred Russel Wallace and how he is being portrayed, particularly as it relates to the idea that natural selection being a blind force without any intelligent guidance. In the film, which is more about explaining how evolution by natural selection works than a biography of its reputed co-founders, has only 2 sentences that mention Wallace, and each time it is co-joined with Darwin's. Here they are. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace co-discovered natural selection in the mid-part of the 19th century, and it is the key mechanism behind how and why our unique genetic book is so configured. We are, in sum, the end result of a blind watchmaker. Darwin's and Wallace's great discovery was that rich complexity can arise naturally without any intelligent guidance whatsoever. Benjamin first wants to raise the issue, though apparently not so contentiously, about whether in actuality Wallace, not Darwin, was the true originator of the theory of evolution. Now, to be clear, neither Wallace or Darwin were the originators of the theory of evolution, since the idea of evolution has a long and fruitful history, going as far back in recorded history to the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander of Miletus, 610 to 546 BCE. Even early Chinese philosophers, including Zhuangzi of the 4th century BCE, argued for the fluidity of species. Now, what Wallace and Darwin co-discovered was the mechanism behind how species evolved over time, and this became more commonly known as natural selection. In Wallace's famous February 1858 paper on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type, this process is explained as, the numbers that die annually must be immense, and as the individual existence of each animal depends upon itself, those that die must be the weakest, the very young, the aged, and the diseased, while those that prolong their existence can only be the most perfect in health and vigor, those who are best able to obtain food regularly and avoid their numerous enemies. It is, as we commenced by remarking, a struggle for existence, in which the weakest and least perfectly organized must always succumb. As to the question of who discovered natural selection, First, it is certainly true that Alfred Russel Wallace's letter to Charles Darwin dated October 10, 1856, which included the article on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species, clearly prompted a crisis of conscience in Darwin. Why? Because Darwin for some 20 years had been writing extensively, but privately, on the same subject as Wallace. Indeed, Darwin had even finished an early manuscript on evolution in 1844, which he wanted his friend Charles Lyell to edit. Eventually, though, an agreement was hashed out by Joseph Hooker and Lyell to have both Darwin's and Wallace's papers jointly submitted and read by the Linnean Society in London, England, which was hurriedly done on July 1, 1858. Understandably, there is still some debate over who deserves priority for the discovery of natural selection. Nevertheless, most scholars agree, and Darwin's notebooks clearly back up this assertion, that Darwin had written about natural selection many years before receiving Wallace's unexpected letter and article. Perhaps most tellingly, Alfred Russel Wallace himself felt that Darwin rightfully deserved the credit he received. As Wallace's sympathetic biographer, Russell Slaughton admits, Wallace considered it a most fortunate circumstance that he had initiated a correspondence with Darwin on the subject of varieties, and thus caused Darwin to move up the publication date of part of his researches. He had no doubt that Darwin's views were more complete than his own and secured the right to claim priority. Wallace himself wrote in 1858, "It would have caused me much pain and regret had Mr. Darwin's excess of generosity led him to make public my paper unaccompanied by his own." Later, after the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, Wallace, after reading the book 5 times, would go on to lavish unabashed praise about what Darwin had achieved. Writes Wallace, "I really feel thankful that it has not been left to me to give the theory to the public. Mr. Darwin has created a new science and a new philosophy, and I believe that never has such a complete illustration of a new branch of human knowledge been due to the labor and researches of a single man. Never have such masses of facts been combined into a system and brought to bear upon the establishment of such a grand and new and simple philosophy." So, in essence, what is natural selection? It is quite simply an explanation of how organisms evolve over time due to differential reproductive successes, and how such advances, preserved over time, tend on average to convey an adaptive character, fitted for longer survival and thus suitable for increased fecundity. Or, as Alfred Russel Wallace himself explained in a letter to Nature in 1891, if there were no selection constantly going on, why should it happen that the kind of variations that occur so frequently under domestication never maintain themselves in a state of nature? Examples of this class are white blackbirds or pigeons, black sheep, and unsymmetrically marked animals generally. These occur not unfrequently, as well as such sports as six-toed or stump-tailed cats, and they all persist and even increase under domestication, but never in a state of nature. And there seems no reason for this but that in the latter case they are quickly eliminated through the struggle for existence, that is, by natural selection. It is important to notice, however, that when Wallace describes how natural selection works, he does not interject anything metaphysical whatsoever. That is precisely why it is called natural selection and not something else. Ironically, for many years, Wallace was considered a stronger advocate of natural selection, almost exclusively, than even Charles Darwin. Where Darwin and Wallace parted company over natural selection is when it came to the evolution of the human mind in Homo sapiens, specifically, how consciousness arose from unconscious molecules. Wallace strenuously argued that natural selection could explain how complexity arose from simpler forms. To wit, my quote, "Darwin's and Wallace's great discovery, that rich complexity can arise naturally without any intelligent guidance whatsoever." However, even though Wallace was a strong advocate of the persuasive power behind natural selection, he felt that human consciousness specifically was of such a high order of organization, and apparently unlike anything else arising in nature by physical and natural processes, that natural selection was insufficient to explain it. This led Wallace to a somewhat abstruse, to cite the exact description by his biographer, model of the human mind and its interaction with nature at large. He did this while he still defended that natural selection was operative, even if it cannot explain the entirety of the human mind. Although Wallace resisted being labeled a dualist, his explanations provide ample evidence for it. Of course, Darwin was taken aback by Wallace's views as first published in 1864, as Darwin chided Wallace, "But I groan over man, you write, like a metamorphosed in retrograde direction naturalist. And you, the author of the best paper that ever appeared in Anthropological Review, eheu, I defy you to upset your own doctrine." Going to the jugular in Wallace's inconsistencies, Jean Claparède wrote in a French journal the following critique. While Mr. Wallace demands the intervention of a superior force to explain the foundation of the human races and to guide man in the path of civilization, he altogether denies the existence of such a force as assisting to produce the inferior races of animals and plants, which attributes entirely to the operation of natural selection. Later, the journal Nature would summarize the critiques of Wallace's not-so-veiled dualism with a series of biting and ironic remarks, including, to say that our brains were made by God, and our lungs by natural selection, is to really exclude the Creator from half his creation, and natural science from half of nature, to fall back for explanation upon the primary efficient cause of their existence, as Wallace does. The design with which they were framed is only to confuse two distinct branches of inquiry. To Wallace's great credit, he responded to the Nature lambast with a very succinct and telling rejoinder, which greatly clarified his increasingly controversial views. "I maintain that man is descended from a lower animal form, but I adduce facts which go to prove that some other law or power than natural selection has specially modified him. If Darwin is not anti-Darwinian in admitting it, as he does the possibility that animals and plants may not have had a common ancestor, I may surely deny that I am anti-Darwinian when I show that there are certain phenomena in the case of man that cannot be wholly explained by natural selection." I think the fundamental difficulty Wallace saw and attempted to address was his inability to imagine that unconscious processes could over time produce conscious self-awareness. Wallace captures this when he opines that it is impossible for us to believe that the mere addition of 1, 2, or 1,000 other material elements to form a more complex molecule could in any way tend to produce a self-conscious existence. Wallace's use of impossible to believe is quite revealing here, since that was the same objection that had been given for years against his own theory about how species mutate over time due to varying environmental conditions. Darwin, of course, saw things quite differently than his friend, and didn't think it was at all impossible to imagine how far-reaching natural selection could be, both in the past and in the future. As Darwin pointed out, we must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. While I applaud Benjamin's desire to provide a richer and fuller context in which to understand Wallace's understanding of evolution with regard to human beings and their self-reflective consciousness, we shouldn't forget that Wallace himself is responsible in part for the idea that rich complexity can arise from simpler materials without invoking a metaphysical intervention. It is only when we come to human beings that Wallace balks and feels that some other force is necessary to explain his self-reflective awareness, a point which, as we have pointed out, with which Darwin quite strenuously disagrees. So while I can readily agree that Wallace has a different view on how human consciousness evolved, I don't think that necessarily detracts or takes away from his great discovery concerning how natural selection works. In other words, Wallace gave birth to the idea of how evolution could work without invoking intelligent design, and thus it would be amiss not to acknowledge his parentage. As Stephen Montgomery explains, Darwin was clearly a bit perplexed by his former ally's new views, and at one point wrote to Wallace pleading with him not to kill our baby. For instance, some atomic theorists who worked on the atomic bomb may wish that they could distance themselves from their horrific invention, but, as we all know, their respective names to its building cannot be so easily erased. Likewise, even if Wallace later wanted to distance himself from his original discovery and its attendant implications, or to introduce a new metaphysical force for human consciousness, there is no getting around the fact that he was himself responsible for introducing a purely naturalistic explanation for why evolution occurs. That is why I included his name along with Darwin's when I said Darwin's and Wallace's great discovery was that rich complexity can arise naturally without any intelligent guidance whatsoever. To leave his name out would, at least in my mind, be akin to deleting a parent's name on a birth certificate. But lest I be accused of overstating my case, I fully acknowledge and deeply appreciate Elliot Benjamin's essay that brings up a more nuanced view of Wallace's views on human evolution specifically. Finally, and in appreciation for Elliot Benjamin's contribution, I think it might be useful to make a little movie on the differences Darwin and Wallace had over how human consciousness may have arisen. I find it deeply revealing that a 19th century argument over what matter can ultimately produce is still being hotly debated in the 21st century. The theme of my next movie will center precisely on what one could call the Wallace paradox. Ross A. Slaughton in The Heretic of Darwin's Court provides us with the guiding theme in our yet-to-be-created movie script. There was no escaping this dilemma. Either all matter was conscious, or consciousness was something distinct from matter. If it was something distinct, then conscious beings were independent of what was termed matter. Section 4. Natural Selection and Metaphysics. I again must applaud Elliot Benjamin's efforts in continuing our discussion on Alfred Russel Wallace and his philosophical views on natural selection, and how far it extends both in the past and in the future. Ironically, it is precisely because of Wallace's later writings on spiritualism and his overt metaphysical leanings that his seminal contributions to evolutionary theory have been greatly overshadowed by Darwin's own writings, which, to be fair, were influenced, particularly his Descent of Man, by Wallace's very timely and pregnant critiques, as can be gleaned from their extensive correspondence. I highly recommend a close examination of their letters to and fro on the Darwin Project website, which contains a vast collection of Darwin's own letters numbering over 7,500 distinct pieces. I think part of the confusion over Wallace's nuanced views can be ameliorated if we distinguish the mechanism of natural selection, which by itself doesn't necessitate anything metaphysical, from how such a sieving process initially arose, first causes, and what it may be incapable of ultimately portending. While it is certainly true that Wallace's later writings create a larger context in which to view natural selection, the eliminating mechanism still works regardless of what spiritual or non-spiritual views one holds. This is analogous in some ways to Isaac Newton's mathematical work on gravity, as espoused in his groundbreaking, even if dense, book, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which provides mathematical and geometric tools to understand classical mechanics, the laws of planetary motion. Newton, however, would later on argue against interpreting his work as suggesting that the cosmos was merely a vast machine-like apparatus, since, as he famously quipped, gravity explains the motions of the planets, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things and knows all that is or can be done. I think something similar is the case with Wallace's own later writings, which attempted to provide a wider hermeneutic and philosophic overview of the universe and its ultimate causation. Therefore, even if it may appear contradictory at first glance. Wallace's original papers on how evolution proceeds via natural selection, like Newton's work on celestial mechanics, are distinct from his later metaphysical imputations. Why? Because just as ocean waves can be understood by the transference of wind energy onto water, without resorting to their ultimate ontology, so too can the mutation of species be understood by natural selection, even if it doesn't address the ultimate causation of how the cosmos first came into existence. This is precisely why the scientific journal Nature criticized Wallace over confusing first and secondary causes when it wrote, "All the phenomena we know are of necessity ultimately referable to the first great cause. The object of science is discover their secondary causes. To fall back for explanation upon the primary efficient cause of their existence, and the design with they were framed, is only to confuse two distinct branches of inquiry." It is for this reason that Alfred Russel Wallace will forever be rightfully cited along with Charles Darwin as the co-discoverer of natural selection, even if in his later writings, like Newton before him, he wishes to see a supernatural teleology behind the universe's unfolding. Simply put, it is called natural selection precisely because it is natural within nature, and empirically testable and observable over time. That there may be other processes at work which are not strictly due to natural selection is certainly true, and is a very fruitful line of inquiry. Ironically, it was Darwin who had to withstand Wallace's harsh criticism when he tried to emphasize the importance of sexual selection in contradistinction to natural selection, since Wallace's advocacy of natural selection was much more orthodox and within limits, more far-reaching than Darwin's. Finally, I want to thank Elliot Benjamin for focusing our attention on the varying and insightful views of Alfred Russel Wallace, whose later contrarian views on the subject of evolution and its creative design deserves more attention than it has received. In this spirit, I am in the process of writing 2 more essays and 2 more little films on Wallace's views on consciousness and his immersion with spiritualism. Darwin's Moral Sense, the Evolution of a Conscience. Charles Darwin was taken aback when Alfred Russel Wallace, his friend and co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection, argued that human development, specifically consciousness and man's higher sensibilities, were an exception to a materialist explanation. As Wallace argued in The Limits of Natural Selection as Applied to Man, 1869-1870, it will therefore probably excite some surprise among my readers to find that I do not consider that all nature can be explained on the principles of which I am so ardent an advocate, and that I am now myself going to state objections and to place limits to the power of natural selection. I believe, however, that there are such limits, and just as surely as we can trace the action of natural laws and the development of organic forms, and can clearly conceive that fuller knowledge would enable us to follow step by step the whole process of that development, so surely we can trace the action of some unknown higher law beyond and independent of all those laws of which we have any knowledge. We can trace this action more or less distinctly in many phenomena, the 2 most important of which are the origin of sensation or consciousness, and the development of man from the lower animals. Wallace believed that there must be a guiding intelligence, something transcending the known laws of physics, that could produce human awareness and morality. As Wallace stressed, it does not seem an improbable conclusion that all force may be will force, and thus that the whole universe is not merely dependent on, but actually is the will of higher intelligence, or of one supreme intelligence. Darwin was somewhat surprised when Wallace warned him in his March 24, 1869 letter that he had doubts about how far natural selection could reach, particularly as exemplified in the higher cognitive abilities of Homo sapiens, warned Wallace. In my forthcoming article in the Quarterly, I venture for the first time on some limitations to the power of natural selection. I am afraid that Huxley and perhaps yourself will think these weak and unphilosophical. I merely wish to know that they are in no way put in to please the quarterly readers. You will hardly suspect me of that, but are the expression of a deep conviction founded on evidence, which I have not alluded to in the article, but which is to me absolutely unassailable. Darwin responded to Wallace just 3 days later on March 27, 1869, in a now famously cited rejoinder lamenting that, "I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." In that same letter, Darwin indicated to Wallace that he was also moving away from ascribing everything to just natural selection, since I have lately, that is, in new edit of Origin, been moderating my zeal and attributing much more to mere useless variability. I did think I would send you the sheet, but I dare say you would not care to see it, in which I discuss Nagala's essay on natural selection, not affecting characters of no functional importance, and which yet are of high classificatory importance. Hooker is pretty well satisfied with what I have said on this head. However, the fundamental difference between Wallace and Darwin was not merely over natural selection and how far it can extend, but rather over materialist versus spiritual explanation of human consciousness and moral sensibility. Where Wallace was more and more comfortable with entertaining a supermundane purpose behind man's mental powers, Darwin was focused on explaining everything, including consciousness, emotions, religion, and even love, by evolutionary processes. As Darwin explained very clearly in the concluding summary of his groundbreaking text, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, 1871, the main conclusion arrived at in this work, namely that man is descended from some lowly organized form, will, I regret to think, be highly distasteful to many. But there can hardly be a doubt that we are descended from barbarians. The astonishment which I felt on first seeing a party of Fuegians on a wild and broken shore will never be forgotten by me, for the reflection at once rushed into my mind, such were our ancestors. These men were absolutely naked and bedaubed with paint, their long hair was tangled, their mouth frothed with excitement, and their expression was wild, startled, and distrustful. They possessed hardly any arts, and, like wild animals, lived on what they could catch. They had no government, and were merciless to every one not of their own small tribe. He who has seen a savage in his native land will not feel much shame if forced to acknowledge that the blood of some more humble creature flows in his veins. For my own part, I would as soon be descended from that heroic little monkey who braved his dreaded enemy in order to save the life of his keeper, or from that old baboon who descended from the mountains, carried away in triumph his young comrade from a crowd of astonished dogs, as from a savage who delights to torture his enemies, offers up bloody sacrifices, practices infanticide, without remorse treats his wives like slaves, knows no decency, and is haunted by the grossest superstitions. Man may be excused for feeling some pride at having risen, though not through his own exertions, to the very summit of the organic scale, and the fact of his having thus risen, instead of having been aboriginally placed there, may give him hope for a still higher destiny in the distant future. But we are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with the truth as far as our reason permits us to discover it, and I have given the evidence to the best of my ability. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Wallace, though a staunch advocate of organic evolution who championed Darwin's idea at almost every turn, held fast to a transcendent view where, while admitting to the full extent the agency of the same great laws of organic development in the origin of the human race as in the origin of all organized beings, there yet seems to be evidence of a power which has guided the action of those laws in definite directions and for special ends. Such, we believe, is the direction in which we shall find the true reconciliation of science with theology on this most momentous problem. Let us fearlessly admit that the mind of man, itself the living proof of a supreme mind, is able to trace, and to a considerable extent has traced, the laws by means of which the organic no less than the inorganic world has been developed. But let us not shut our eyes to the evidence that an overruling intelligence has watched over the action of those laws, so directing variations and so determining their accumulation as finally to produce an organization sufficiently perfect to admit of, and even to aid in, the indefinite advancement of our mental and moral nature. It is important to understand Wallace's views, since they highlight the historical context in which Charles Darwin wrote his magisterial The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex. In some very specific ways, Darwin was detailing why evolution could explain what Wallace thought was inexplicable by purely naturalistic methodologies. While Wallace would delve deeper into his spiritualist researches, exploring such topics as phrenology and seances, Darwin continued to look for physical explanations for why human psychology emerged as it did and for what benefit. He gave a preview of his overall viewpoint earlier in his newly updated book, The Origin of Species, 6th edition, when he prophesied, "In the future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be securely based on the foundation already well laid by Mr. Herbert Spencer, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." For Wallace, he looked for something beyond a purely Darwinian, to use Wallace's own term for evolution by natural selection, explanation, behind human thinking and feeling. As Stephen Montgomery, writing for the 200th birthday celebration of Charles Darwin, explains, by the late 1860s, Wallace had become a spiritualist, and perhaps linked to this began to reject evolutionary explanations of human intelligence and abilities, instead invoking the unseen universe of spirit. This, he claimed, had intervened in the normal run of natural selection 3 times, at the creation of life, the introduction of consciousness, and the generation of man's mental capacities. Later in his life, Wallace also believed in teleology, the idea that the development of the universe has had a direction, and that direction is towards the perfection of man. There are suggestions that Wallace also applied his teleology to evolution. All of this serves, I believe, as a necessary preface to understand why Ken Wilber's recent attempt for the love of Darwin beyond the selfish gene, February 16, 2015, to hijack Darwin's naturalistic tendency and transfigure it, is at best misleading and at worst intellectually dishonest. Much has been made, indeed an entire book, Darwin in Love, by David Loy, that Charles Darwin mentions the word love and moral sensitivity over 90 times in The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex, but he only used the phrase survival of the fittest twice, as if this was somehow a revelation of earth-shattering proportions. In the prefatory remarks to Wilber and Loy's recorded conversations for Integral Life, the editor opines, it becomes clear that something important is missing from our current discussions of Darwin and the evolutionary process. Well, good thing David and Ken are here to help set the record straight. The implication running throughout the interview is that somehow Darwin's evolutionary views on morality and love have somehow been woefully neglected by more traditional scholars, since they, according to Wilber and his ilk, overly stress the essentials about this is that the way Darwin is particularly interpreted today is the Darwin of the survival of the fittest and the selfish gene, and nothing but it's a jungle out there, and it's a vicious world, and it's nasty, brutish, and short, and that's the way nature is built, and therefore that's the way humans are built as well, and this has been used for a justification of all sorts of the most vile and wretched human behavior imaginable. Here Ken Wilber is creating a classic straw man argument, since evolutionists are not made out of a single cloth, nor do the majority of them agree with justifying vile and wretched human behavior because of Darwinism. In his overly sweeping generalization, a trait typical of him, Wilber is setting up a false caricature of evolutionary biology and impugning the integrity of thousands of scientists who are deeply engaged in understanding human psychology in light of what Darwin and others have uncovered. Indeed, The whole field of sociobiology, later morphed under the more politically correct term evolutionary psychology, is a serious extension of what Darwin outlined in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Wilbur even claims Darwin's theory of what love was and is, both in its most basic and intimate and widest possible sense. It was in the end to become a theory of love as the vital prime driver in the crucial moral evolution of our species, which in his version was like a skyrocket into the dark sky of history, and so the role of love and moral sensitivity turns out to have quite a central place in Darwin's overall theory, doesn't it? Yet Darwin's invocation of love has absolutely nothing to do with Wilbur's ontological positioning of it in his integral theory. It is sexual selection and survival of individuals within a nested network, family, friends, and tribes, that is the real focus and prime mover behind why love arises in the first place. Contrary to Wilbur's presupposition, Darwin is not reifying love, nor equating it in any way with integral theory's notion of eros. Using Wilbur and Loy's own questionable methodology underlines this very point, since the word sex appears nearly 20 times more than the word love in The Descent of Man. Is word count really an insightful way to truly understand a theory? I think not, particularly when such word choices invariably come embedded within an informing and necessary context. Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, for instance, to take just one stark example, mentions the word love in some form over 40 times. The real question is why Darwin raises the issue of love and ethics in The Descent of Man, and the answer is very clear. He wants to explain how such higher emotions could arise through natural processes and are not due to some divine agency. The feelings of love, a highly developed conscience, and moral sensibilities are the results, not the initial causes of naturalistic processes. Wilbur hurriedly skips over this important caveat since Darwin's materialistic agenda versus Wallace's doesn't square with his teleological theory that, to quote Wilbur directly, all of this, without exception, is driven by love. Contrary to Darwin's understanding of how life evolves over time, Wilbur posits there is no way in hell that the universe went from atoms to Shakespeare out of random stabs. This is an extraordinarily driven process. Wilbur's lame attempt to massage Darwin's naturalist and non-teleological understanding of why higher emotions arose in the first place in animals and later human beings is to deeply misread The Descent of Man, particularly when even those thinkers who advocate intelligent design don't bastardize Darwin this badly. As Benjamin Wilker, a Roman Catholic ethicist writing for the Discovery Institute, lucidly explains, there is no reason for guesswork on Darwin's views of morality. He set them out all too clearly in his Descent of Man, 1871, the book in which he applied his theory of evolution to human beings. In it, Darwin very meticulously attempts to explain everything human as an effect of natural or sexual selection, everything including morality. Moreover, Wilker argues that The Descent was written in part to convince Darwin's closest friends and evolutionary allies, Charles Lyell, Asa Gray, and Alfred Wallace, his acknowledged co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection, that natural selection could explain all of human evolution. Lyell, Gray, and Wallace affirmed natural selection as a cause of human evolution, but an insufficient one to account for our moral and intellectual capacities. They believed the evidence of our qualitatively distinct moral and intellectual capacities implied a divine hand in the process. Darwin vehemently objected. He would not allow any divine causality at all. The Descent of Man was written to show Lyell, Gray, and Wallace that a godless account, relying on random variation, natural selection, and sexual selection, could explain every aspect of human nature that might appear too elevated, too divine-like to have been caused by natural processes alone. Morality was just one aspect Darwin attempted to explain, but it is important that it must be understood as an attempt to remove any need for God. Darwin is strictly and exactly speaking a godless account of morality. Furthermore, it is disingenuous for Wilbur to suggest that evolutionists have somehow ignored Darwin's theory on morality, when in terms of historical trajectories, there has been an extensive literature and discussion on precisely why humans appreciate beauty, fall in love, and perform altruistic acts. Wilbur, and not the neo-Darwinist he repeatedly mischaracterizes, is caught in a web of sloganeering when he reduces evolutionary thinking to a series of sound bites. Would Darwin, even at his most sentimental, agree with integral life summation of Wilbur's view on love's role in evolution? Rather than just a mere human emotion, love is cast as a central driving force in the cosmos, the force of Eros itself, pushing all of us along our inevitable return to spirit. Love and Evolution, June 9, 2010. So why is Wilbur trying to shoehorn Darwin back into his integral agenda, when Darwin himself wouldn't see eye to eye with such a ploy? Charles Darwin, unlike colleague Alfred Russel Wallace, wants to understand how natural selection and in turn sexual selection could naturally, but not with divine intent, and certainly not with Eros guiding such from the beginning of time, would under certain environmental conditions produce moral sensibility. In an extended passage from The Descent of Man, Darwin explains how human sensitivity may have arisen. It deserves notice that as soon as the progenitors of man became social, and this probably occurred at a very early period, the principle of imitation and reason and experience would have increased, and much modified the intellectual powers in a way of which we see only traces in the lower animals. Apes are much given to imitation, as are the lowest savages, and the simple fact previously referred to, that after a time no animal could be caught in the same place by the same sort of trap, shows that animals learn by experience and imitate the caution of others. Now, if some one man in a tribe, more sagacious than the others, invented a new snare or weapon or other means of attack or defense, the plainest self-interest without the assistance of much reasoning power would prompt the other members to imitate him, and all would thus profit. The habitual practice of each new art must likewise in some slight degree strengthen the intellect. If the new invention were an important one, the tribe would increase in number and spread and supplant other tribes. In a tribe thus rendered more numerous, there would always be a rather greater chance of the birth of other superior and inventive members. If such men left children to inherit their mental superiority, the chance of the birth of still more ingenious members would be somewhat better, and in a very small tribe decidedly better. Even if they left no children, the tribe would still include their blood relations, and it has been ascertained by agriculturalists that by preserving and breeding from the family of an animal, which when slaughtered was found to be valuable, the desired character has been obtained. Turning now to the social and moral faculties. In order that primeval men or the ape-like progenitors of man should become social, they must have acquired the same instinctive feelings which impel other animals to live in a body, and they no doubt exhibited the same general disposition. They would have felt uneasy when separated from their comrades, for whom they would have felt some degree of love, they would have warned each other of danger, and have given mutual aid in attack or defense. All this implies some degree of sympathy, fidelity, and courage. Such social qualities, the paramount importance of which to the lower animals is disputed by no one, were no doubt acquired by the progenitors of man in a similar manner, namely through natural selection aided by inherited habit. When two tribes of primeval man, living in the same country, came into competition, if, other circumstances being equal, the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members, who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. Let it be borne in mind how all-important in the never-ceasing wars of savages fidelity and courage must be. The advantage which disciplined soldiers have over undisciplined hordes follows chiefly from the confidence which each man feels in his comrades. Obedience, as Mr. Bagehot has well shown, is of the highest value, for any form of government is better than none. Selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence nothing can be effected. A tribe rich in the above qualities would spread and be victorious over other tribes, but in the course of time it would, judging from all past history, be in its turn overcome by some other tribe still more highly endowed. Thus the social and moral qualities would tend slowly to advance and be diffused throughout the world. Several lines down from this passage, after adducing more evidence for the natural history for moral progression, Charles Darwin summarizes his theory thusly: ultimately, our moral sense or conscience becomes a highly complex sentiment, originating in the social instincts, largely guided by the approbation of our fellow men, ruled by reason, self-interest, and in later times by deep religious feelings, and confirmed by instruction and habit. Ironically, Darwin is biologically prefiguring Nietzsche's more philosophical observation that which does not kill us makes us stronger, which in Darwin's sense simply means humans as social animals were more likely to survive if they could bond together versus continually infighting. To what practical purpose does love serve if everything is destined to decay and die? The answer is simpler than we might wish to admit. It makes us commit. And that very act of committing has a survival value, particularly when pair bonding, family bonding, tribal bonding, and so on gives one greater resources than merely confronting the world alone. Wilbur and Lloyd's contention that Darwin's moral sense has somehow been buried or hidden from view is contradicted by decades of research in precisely this area. John C. Green, 56 years ago, captured the essence of Darwin's views on why humans developed a conscience in his book, The Death of Adam, Evolution and Its Impact on Western Thought. There is no question, Darwin continued, that man had strong social instincts, probably acquired at a very early period through the advantage they conferred on tribes possessing them. When to these instincts were added growing powers of reflection on past events and impressions, a moral sense would inevitably emerge. The individual would feel that he ought to obey the dictates of group sentiment. Feelings of shame and guilt would follow if he did not. Thus he would acquire a conscience. Love in this context acts as a cohesive glue, whether it be for mating, child-rearing, or for larger family tribal protection. None of this, of course, is all that surprising, and Darwinian scholars from Huxley onwards have included such in their own respective theories. This reminds me of a silly but telling joke I heard in graduate school back in the 1980s about how increased populations alter one's outward behavior. What do 10 monkeys do in an elevator? Not much, just like humans, heads down or up, but not much looking around. Monkeys and humans tend to behave. Okay, what does one monkey do in an elevator? Anything he wants. A conscience doesn't arise in a vacuum, but from group interaction, even if over time, like Chomsky's notion of language, we may have inherited a predisposition for it. In other words, almost all human beings are born with the capacity for self-reflection and for feeling a sense of doing something right and something wrong. But what we feel guilty about is to a large measure, perhaps with some interesting biological exceptions, sociologically variable. Here environmental conditions play a dramatic role and should never be underestimated, even if we champion underlying structural inclinations. I originally critiqued Ken Wilber over evolution nearly 20 years ago, not because he wanted to champion his own version of intelligent or is that love design, but because he completely misrepresented the current state of the theory. Darwin is not in Wilber's camp, no matter how one tries to wiggle him into fit an integral paradigm entrenched as it is with a directional aim for evolution. Charles Darwin, in his autobiography, summarized his contrarian view precisely when he wrote, "The old argument from design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows." As I was writing this particular essay, I happened to visit my local Huntington Beach library, where I go thrice weekly for book hunting, since they have a wonderful used bookstore just inside the main entrance. But before I entered the building, I decided to play my usual Littlewood's Law of Miracles game based on the famous mathematician's pregnant supposition that we should expect the unexpected every 35 days on average, given the theory of large numbers. So I ruminated to myself, even though I have several fine editions of Darwin's The Descent of Man, I don't want to mark those up, so I need a nice paperback version, preferably one with scholarly introductions and notes. As I was thinking this thought, the very first book I came upon, almost as if it was waiting for me, was Darwin's The Descent of Man in a nice paperback volume published by Princeton University Press, with introductions by John Tyler Bonner and Robert M. May. But Littlewood was not yet done with me, as just below on the next shelf was John Green's insightful 1959 volume, The Death of Adam, Evolution and Its Impact on Western Thought. I love these kinds of coincidences, but here I side again with Darwin on his views concerning design in nature, and I apply it with equal measure to my intriguing book finds. There seems to be no more design in the variability of my book choices and of what I find than in the course of which my mind wanders. Of course I slightly jest, but finding meaning and purpose in what I discover in books is not dissimilar in its import than what we might project onto nature herself, which seems oblivious to our intentional desires and what we ultimately impute upon them. Section 6. Darwin's and Wallace's original papers on natural selection. Linnaean Society, London, June 30th, 1858. My dear Sir, the accompanying papers which we have the honor of communicating to the Linnaean Society, and which all relate to the same subject, viz. The laws which affect the production of varieties, races, and species, contain the results of the investigations of two indefatigable naturalists, Mr. Charles Darwin and Mr. Alfred Wallace. These gentlemen, having independently and unknown to one another conceived the same very ingenious theory to account for the appearance and perpetuation of varieties and of specific forms on our planet, may both fairly claim the merit of being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry, but neither of them having published his views, though Mr. Darwin has for many years past been repeatedly urged by us to do so, and both authors having now unreservedly placed their papers in our hands, we think it would best promote the interests of science that a selection from them should be laid before the Linnaean Society. Taken in the order of their dates, they consist of 1. Extracts from a MS work on species by Mr. Darwin, which was sketched in 1839 and copied in 1844, when the copy was read by Dr. Hooker, and its contents afterwards communicated to Sir Charles Lyell. The first part is devoted to the variation of organic beings under domestication and in their natural state, and the second chapter of that part, from which we propose to read to the Society, the extracts referred to, is headed, On the Variation of Organic Beings in a State of Nature, on the Natural Means of Selection, on the Comparison of Domestic Races and True Species. 2. An abstract of a private letter addressed to Professor Asa Gray, of Boston, U.S., in October 1857, by Mr. Darwin, in which he repeats his views and which shows that these remained unaltered from 1839 to 1857. 3. An essay by Mr. Wallace entitled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. This was written at Turnet in February 1858 for the perusal of his friend and correspondent, Mr. Darwin, and sent to him with the expressed wish that it should be forwarded to Sir Charles Lyell, if Mr. Darwin thought it sufficiently novel and interesting. So highly did Mr. Darwin appreciate the value of the views therein set forth, that he proposed in a letter to Sir Charles Lyell to obtain Mr. Wallace's consent to allow the essay to be published as soon as possible. Of this step we highly approved, provided Mr. Darwin did not withhold from the public, as he was strongly inclined to do in favor of Mr. Wallace, the memoir which he himself had written on the same subject, and which, as before stated, one of us had perused in 1844, and the contents of which we had both of us been privy to for many years. On representing this to Mr. Darwin, he gave us permission to make what use we thought proper of his memoir, and in adopting our present course of presenting it to the Linnean Society, we have explained to him that we are not solely considering the relative claims to priority of himself and his friend, but the interests of science generally, for we feel it to be desirable that views founded on a wide deduction from facts and matured by years of reflection should constitute at once a goal from which others may start, and that, while the scientific world is waiting for the appearance of Mr. Darwin's complete work, some of the leading results of his labors, as well as those of his able correspondent, should together be laid before the public. We have the honor to be yours, very obediently, Charles Lyell, Joseph D. Hooker, J. J. Bennett, Esquire, Secretary of the Linnean Society. 1. Extract from an unpublished work on species by C. Darwin, Esquire, consisting of a portion of a chapter entitled, On the Variation of Organic Beings in a State of Nature, on the Natural Means of Selection, on the Comparison of Domestic Races and True Species. Deckendall, in an eloquent passage, has declared that all nature is at war, one organism with another, or with external nature. Seeing the contented face of nature, this may at first well be doubted, but reflection will inevitably prove it to be true. The war, however, is not constant, but recurrent in a slight degree at short periods, and more severely at occasionally more distant periods, and hence its effects are easily overlooked. It is the doctrine of Malthus applied in most cases with tenfold force. As in every climate there are seasons, for each of its inhabitants of greater and less abundance, so all annually breed, and the moral restraint which in some small degree checks the increase of mankind is entirely lost. Even slow-breeding mankind has doubled in 25 years, and if he could increase his food with greater ease, he would double in less time. But for animals without artificial means, the amount of food for each species must on an average be constant, whereas the increase of all organisms tends to be geometrical, and in a vast majority of cases at an enormous ratio. Suppose in a certain spot there are 8 pairs of birds, and that only 4 pairs of them annually, including double hatches, rear only 4 young, and that these go on rearing their young at the same rate, then at the end of 7 years, a short life excluding violent deaths for any bird, there will be 2,048 birds instead of the original 16. As this increase is quite impossible, we must conclude either that birds do not rear nearly half their young, or that the average life of a bird is, from accident, not nearly 7 years. Both checks probably concur. The same kind of calculation applied to all plants and animals affords results more or less striking, but in very few instances more striking than in man. Many practical illustrations of this rapid tendency to increase are on record, among which during peculiar seasons are the extraordinary numbers of certain animals. For instance, during the years of 1826 to 1828, in La Plata, when from drought some millions of cattle perished, the whole country actually swarmed with mice. Now I think it cannot be doubted that during the breeding season, all the mice, with the exception of a few males or females in excess, ordinarily pair, and therefore that this astounding increase during 3 years must be attributed to a greater number than usual surviving the first year, and then breeding and so on till the 3rd year, when their numbers were brought down to their usual limits on the return of wet weather. Where man has introduced plants and animals into a new and favorable country, there are many accounts in how surprisingly few years the whole country has become stocked with them. This increase would necessarily stop as soon as the country was fully stocked, and yet we have every reason to believe from what is known of wild animals that all would pair in the spring. In the majority of cases, it is most difficult to imagine where the checks fall, though generally, no doubt, on the seeds, eggs, and young. But when we remember how impossible even in mankind, so much better known than any other animal, it is to infer from repeated casual observations what the average duration of life is, or to discover the different percentage of deaths to births in different countries, we ought to feel no surprise at our being unable to discover where the check falls in any animal or plant. It should always be remembered that in most cases the checks are recurrent yearly in a small, regular degree, and in an extreme degree during unusually cold, hot, dry, or wet years, according to the constitution of the being in question. Lighten any check in the least degree, and the geometrical powers of increase in every organism will almost instantly increase the average number of the favored species. Nature may be compared to a surface on which rest 10,000 sharp wedges, touching each other and driven inwards by incessant blows. Fully to realize these views, much reflection is requisite. Malthus on man should be studied, and all such cases as those of the mice in La Plata, of the cattle and horses when first turned out in South America, of the birds by our calculation, etc., should be well considered. Reflect on the enormous multiplying power inherent and annually in action in all animals. Reflect on the countless seeds scattered by 100 ingenious contrivances, year after year, over the whole face of the land, and yet we have every reason to suppose that the average percentage of each of the inhabitants of a country usually remains constant. Finally, let it be borne in mind that this average number of individuals, the external conditions remaining the same in each country, is kept up by recurrent struggles against other species or against external nature, such as on the borders of the Arctic regions, where the cold checks life, and that ordinarily each individual of every species holds its place, either by its own struggle and capacity of acquiring nourishment in some period of its life, from the egg upwards, or by the struggle of its parents in short-lived organisms when the main check occurs at longer intervals, with other individuals of the same or different species. But let the external conditions of a country alter. If in a small degree, the relative proportions of the inhabitants will in most cases simply be slightly changed. But let the number of inhabitants be small as on an island, and free access to it from other countries be circumscribed, and let the change of conditions continue progressing, forming new stations. In such a case, the original inhabitants must cease to be as perfectly adapted to the changed conditions as they were originally. It has been shown in a former part of this work that such changes of external conditions would, from their acting on the reproductive system, probably cause the organization of those beings which were most affected to become, as under domestication, plastic. Now, can it be doubted from the struggle each individual has to obtain subsistence that any minute variation in structure, habits, or instincts, adapting that individual better to the new conditions, would tell upon its vigor and health? In this struggle, it would have a better chance of surviving, and those of its offspring which inherited the variation, be it ever so slight, would also have a better chance. Yearly more are bred than can survive. The smallest grain in the balance in the long run must tell on which death shall fall, and which shall survive. Let this work of selection on the one hand, and death on the other, go on for 1,000 generations. Who will pretend to affirm that it would produce no effect, when we remember what, in a few years, Bakewell effected in cattle, and Western in sheep, by this identical principle of selection? To give an imaginary example from changes in progress on an island, let the organization of a canine animal, which preyed chiefly on rabbits but sometimes on hares, become slightly plastic. Let these same changes cause the number of rabbits very slowly to decrease and the number of hares to increase. The effect of this would be that the fox or dog would be driven to try to catch more hares. His organization, however, being slightly plastic, those individuals with the lightest forms, longest limbs, and best eyesight, let the difference be ever so small, would be slightly favored, and would tend to live longer and to survive during that time of the year when food was scarcest. They would also rear more young, which would tend to inherit these slight peculiarities. The less fleet ones would be rigidly destroyed. I can see no more reason to doubt that these causes in 1,000 generations would produce a marked effect and adapt the form of the fox or dog to the catching of hares instead of rabbits, than that greyhounds can be improved by selection and careful breeding. So would it be with plants under similar circumstances. If the number of individuals of a species with plumed seeds could be increased by greater powers of dissemination within its own area, that is, if the check to increase fell chiefly on the seeds, those seeds which were provided with ever so little more down would in the long run be most disseminated. Hence a greater number of seeds thus formed would germinate, and would tend to produce plants inheriting the slightly better adapted down. Besides this natural means of selection, by which those individuals are preserved, whether in their egg or larval or mature state, which are best adapted to the place they fill in nature, there is a second agency at work in most unisexual animals, tending to produce the same effect, namely, the struggle of the males for the females. These struggles are generally decided by the law of battle, but in the case of birds, apparently by the charms of their song, by their beauty, or their power of courtship, as in the dancing rock thrush of Guiana. The most vigorous and healthy males, implying perfect adaptation, must generally gain the victory in their contests. This kind of selection, however, is less rigorous than the other. It does not require the death of the less successful, but gives to them fewer descendants. The struggle falls, moreover, at a time of year when food is generally abundant, and perhaps the effect chiefly produced would be the modification of the secondary sexual characters, which are not related to the power of obtaining food or to defense from enemies, but to fighting with or rivaling other males. The result of this struggle amongst the males may be compared in some respects to that produced by those agriculturalists who pay less attention to the careful selection of all their young animals and more to the occasional use of a choice mate. 2. Abstract of a letter from C. Darwin, Esquire, to Professor Asa Gray, Boston, U.S., dated down September 5, 1857. 1. It is wonderful what the principle of selection by man, that is, the picking out of individuals with any desired quality, and breeding from them, and again picking out, can do. Even breeders have been astounded at their own results. They can act on differences inappreciable to an uneducated eye. Selection has been methodically followed in Europe for only the last half-century, but it was occasionally and even in some degree methodically followed in the most ancient times. There must have been also a kind of unconscious selection from a remote period, namely in the preservation of the individual animals, without any thought of their offspring, most useful to each race of man in his particular circumstances. The roguing, as nurserymen call the destroying of varieties which depart from their type, is a kind of selection. I am convinced that intentional and occasional selection has been the main agent in the production of our domestic races. But however this may be, its great power of modification has been indisputably shown in later times. Selection acts only by the accumulation of slight or greater variations, caused by external conditions, or by the mere fact that in generation the child is not absolutely similar to its parent. Man, by this power of accumulating variations, adapts living beings to his wants, may be said to make the wool of one sheep good for carpets, of another for cloth, etc. 2. Now suppose there were a being who did not judge by mere external appearances, but who could study the whole internal organization, who was never capricious, and should go on selecting for one object during millions of generations, who will say what he might not effect? In nature we have some slight variation occasionally in all parts, and I think it can be shown that changed conditions of existence is the main cause of the child not exactly resembling its parents, and in nature geology shows us what changes have taken place and are taking place. We have almost unlimited time. No one but a practical geologist can fully appreciate this. Think of the glacial period, during the whole of which the same species at least of shells have existed. There must have been during this period millions on millions of generations. 3. I think it can be shown that there is such an unerring power at work in natural selection, the title of my book, which selects exclusively for the good of each organic being. The Elder de Candolle, W. Herbert, and Lyell have written excellently on the struggle for life, but even they have not written strongly enough. Reflect that every being, even the elephant, breeds at such a rate that in a few years, or at most a few centuries, the surface of the earth would not hold the progeny of one pair. I have found it hard constantly to bear in mind that this increase of every single species is checked during some part of its life or during some shortly recurrent generation. Only a few of those annually born can live to propagate their kind. What a trifling difference must often determine which shall survive and which perish. 4. Now take the case of a country undergoing some change. This will tend to cause some of its inhabitants to vary slightly, but not that I believe most beings vary at all times enough for selection to act on them. Some of its inhabitants will be exterminated, and the remainder will be exposed to the mutual action of a different set of inhabitants, which I believe to be far more important to the life of each being than mere climate. Considering the infinitely various methods which living beings follow to obtain food by struggling with other organisms, to escape danger at various times of life, to have their eggs or seeds disseminated, etc., etc., I cannot doubt that during millions of generations individuals of a species would be occasionally born with some slight variation, profitable to some part of their economy. Such individuals will have a better chance of surviving and of propagating their new and slightly different structure, and the modification may be slowly increased by the accumulative action of natural selection to any profitable extent. The variety thus formed will either coexist with, or more commonly will exterminate its parent form. An organic being like the woodpecker or mistletoe may thus come to be adapted to a score of contingencies, natural selection accumulating those slight variations in all parts of its structure which are in any way useful to it during any part of its life. 5. Multiform difficulties will occur to every one with respect to this theory. Many can, I think, be satisfactorily answered. Meteora non facit saltum answers some of the most obvious. The slowness of the change, and only a very few individuals undergoing change at any one time, answers others. The extreme imperfection of our geological records answers others. 6. Another principle, which may be called the principle of divergence, plays, I believe, an important part in the origin of species. The same spot will support more life if occupied by very diverse forms. We see this in the many generic forms in a square yard of turf and in the plants or insects on any little uniform islet, belonging almost invariably to as many genera and families as species. We can understand the meaning of this fact amongst the higher animals, whose habits we understand. We know it has been experimentally shown that a plot of land will yield a greater weight if sown with several species and genera of grasses than if sown with only 2 or 3 species. Now, every organic being, by propagating so rapidly, may be said to be striving its utmost to increase in numbers. So it will be with the offspring of any species after it has become diversified into varieties or subspecies or true species. And it follows, I think, from the foregoing facts, that the varying offspring of each species will try, only few will succeed, to seize on as many and as diverse places in the economy of nature as possible. Each new variety or species, when formed, will generally take the place of and thus exterminate its less well-fitted parent. This I believe to be the origin of the classification and affinities of organic beings at all times. For organic beings always seem to branch and sub-branch like the limbs of a tree from a common trunk, the flourishing and diverging twigs destroying the less vigorous, the dead and lost branches rudely representing extinct genera and families. This sketch is most imperfect, but in so short a space I cannot make it better. Your imagination must fill up very wide blanks. See Darwin. I can see no more difficulty in this than in the planter improving his varieties of the cotton plant. Signed, C.D., 1858. 3. On the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type, by Alfred Russel Wallace. One of the strongest arguments which have been adduced to prove the origin and permanent distinctness of species is that varieties produced in a state of domesticity are more or less unstable, and often have a tendency, if left to themselves, to return to the normal form of the parent species, and this instability is considered to be a distinctive peculiarity of all varieties, even of those occurring among wild animals in a state of nature, and to constitute a provision for preserving unchanged the originally created distinct species. In the absence or scarcity of facts and observations as to varieties occurring among wild animals, this argument has had great weight with naturalists, and has led to a very general and somewhat prejudiced belief in the stability of species. Equally general, however, is the belief in what are called permanent or true varieties, races of animals which continually propagate their like, but which differ so slightly, although constantly, from some other race, that the one is considered to be a variety of the other. Which is the variety in which the original species, there is generally no means of determining, except in those rare cases in which the one race has been known to produce an offspring unlike itself and resembling the other. This, however, would seem quite incompatible with the permanent invariability of species. But the difficulty is overcome by assuming that such varieties have strict limits, and can never again vary further from the original type, although they may return to it, which from the analogy of the domesticated animals is considered to be highly probable, if not certainly proved. It will be observed that this argument rests entirely on the assumption that varieties occurring in a state of nature are in all respects analogous to or even identical with those of domestic animals, and are governed by the same laws as regards their permanence or further variation. But it is the object of the present paper to show that this assumption is altogether false, that there is a general principle in nature which will cause many varieties to survive the parent species and to give rise to successive variations departing further and further from the original type, and which also produces in domesticated animals the tendency of varieties to return to the parent form. The life of wild animals is a struggle for existence. The full exertion of all their faculties and all their energies is required to preserve their own existence and provide for that of their infant offspring. The possibility of procuring food during the least favorable seasons, and of escaping the attacks of their most dangerous enemies, are the primary conditions which determine the existence both of individuals and of entire species. These conditions will also determine the population of a species, and, by a careful consideration of all the circumstances, enable to comprehend and in some degree to explain what at first sight appears so inexplicable, the excessive abundance of some species, while others closely allied to them are very rare. The general proportion that must obtain between certain groups of animals is readily seen. Large animals cannot be so abundant as small ones. The carnivora must be less numerous than the herbivora. Eagles and lions can never be so plentiful as pigeons and antelopes. The wild asses of the Tartarian deserts cannot equal in numbers the horses of the more luxuriant prairies and pampas of America. The greater or less fecundity of an animal is often considered to be one of the chief causes of its abundance or scarcity, but a consideration of the facts will show us that it really has little or nothing to do with the matter. Even the least prolific of animals would increase rapidly if unchecked, whereas it is evident that the animal population of the globe must be stationary, or perhaps through the influence of man decreasing. Fluctuations there may be, but permanent increase except in restricted localities is almost impossible. For example, our own observation must convince us that birds do not go on increasing every year in a geometrical ratio, as they would do were there not some powerful check to their natural increase. Very few birds produce less than 2 young ones each year, while many have 6, 8, or 10. 4 will certainly be below the average, and if we suppose that each pair produce young only 4 times in their life, that will also be below the average, supposing them not to die either by violence or want of food. Yet at this rate, how tremendous would be the increase in a few years from a single pair. A simple calculation will show that in 15 years, each pair of birds would have increased to nearly 10 millions, whereas we have no reason to believe that the number of the birds of any country increases at all in 15 or in 150 years. With such powers of increase, the population must have reached its limits and have become stationary in a very few years after the origin of each species. It is evident, therefore, that each year an immense number of birds must perish, as many, in fact, as are born, and as on the lowest calculation the progeny are each year twice as numerous as their parents, it follows that, whatever be the average number of individuals existing in any given country, twice that number must perish annually, a striking result, but one which seems at least highly probable, and is perhaps under rather than over the truth. It would therefore appear that as far as the continuance of the species, and the keeping up the average number of individuals are concerned, large broods are superfluous. On the average, all above one become food for hawks and kites, wildcats and weasels, or perish of cold and hunger as winter comes on. This is strikingly proved by the case of particular species, for we find that their abundance in individuals bears no relation whatever to their fertility in producing offspring. Perhaps the most remarkable instance of an immense bird population is that of the passenger pigeon of the United States, which lays only one or at most two eggs, and is said to rear generally but one young one. Why is this bird so extraordinarily abundant, while others producing 2 or 3 times as many young are much less plentiful? The explanation is not difficult. The food most congenial to this species, and on which it thrives best, is abundantly distributed over a very extensive region, offering such differences of soil and climate that in one part or another of the area the supply never fails. The bird is capable of a very rapid and long-continued flight, so that it can pass without fatigue over the whole of the district it inhabits, and as soon as the supply of food begins to fail in one place, is able to discover a fresh feeding ground. This example strikingly shows us that the procuring a constant supply of wholesome food is almost the sole condition requisite for ensuring the rapid increase of a given species, since neither the limited fecundity nor the unrestrained attacks of birds of prey and of man are here sufficient to check it. In no other birds are these peculiar circumstances so strikingly combined. Either their food is more liable to failure, or they have not sufficient power of wing to search for it over an extensive area, or during some season of the year it becomes very scarce, and less wholesome substitutes have to be found, and thus, though more fertile in offspring, they can never increase beyond the supply of food in the least favorable seasons. Many birds can only exist by migrating when their food becomes scarce, to regions possessing a milder, or at least a different climate, though as these migrating birds are seldom excessively abundant, it is evident that the countries they visit are still deficient in a constant and abundant supply of wholesome food. Those whose organization does not permit them to migrate when their food becomes periodically scarce can never attain a large population. This is probably the reason why woodpeckers are scarce with us, while in the tropics they are among the most abundant of solitary birds. Thus the house sparrow is more abundant than the redbreast, because its food is more constant and plentiful, seeds of grasses being preserved during the winter, and our farmyards and stubble fields furnishing an almost inexhaustible supply. Why, as a general rule, are aquatic and especially seabirds very numerous in individuals? Not because they are more prolific than others, generally the contrary, but because their food never fails, the seashores and river banks daily swarming with a fresh supply of small mollusca and crustacea. Exactly the same laws will apply to mammals. Wild cats are prolific and have few enemies. Why, then, are they never as abundant as rabbits? The only intelligible answer is that their supply of food is more precarious. It appears evident, therefore, that so long as a country remains physically unchanged, the numbers of its animal population cannot materially increase. If one species does so, some others requiring the same kind of food must diminish in proportion. The numbers that die annually must be immense, and as the individual existence of each animal depends upon itself, those that die must be the weakest, the very young, the aged, and the diseased, while those that prolong their existence can only be the most perfect in health and vigor, those who are best able to obtain food regularly and avoid their numerous enemies. It is, as we commenced by remarking, a struggle for existence, in which the weakest and least perfectly organized must always succumb. Now, it is clear that what takes place among the individuals of a species must also occur among the several allied species of a group, viz., that those which are best adapted to obtain a regular supply of food and to defend themselves against the attacks of their enemies and the vicissitudes of the seasons must necessarily obtain and preserve a superiority in population, while those species which, from some defect of power or organization, are the least capable of counteracting the vicissitudes of food, supply, etc., must diminish in numbers and in extreme cases become altogether extinct. Between these extremes, the species will present various degrees of capacity for ensuring the means of preserving life, and it is thus we account for the abundance or rarity of species. Our ignorance will generally prevent us from accurately tracing the effects to their causes, but could we become perfectly acquainted with the organization and habits of the various species of animals, and could we measure the capacity of each for performing the different acts necessary to its safety and existence under all the varying circumstances by which it is surrounded, we might be able even to calculate the proportionate abundance of individuals, which is the necessary result. If now we have succeeded in establishing these 2 points, first, that the animal population of a country is generally stationary, being kept down by a periodical deficiency of food and other checks, and second, that the comparative abundance or scarcity of the individuals of the several species is entirely due to their organization and resulting habits, which, rendering it more difficult to procure a regular supply of food and to provide for their personal safety in some cases than in others, can only be balanced by a difference in the population which have to exist in a given area. We shall be in a condition to proceed to the consideration of varieties, to which the preceding remarks have a direct and very important application. Most or perhaps all the variations from the typical form of a species must have some definite effect, however slight, on the habits or capacities of the individuals. Even a change of color might, by rendering them more or less distinguishable, affect their safety. A greater or less development of hair might modify their habits. More important changes, such as an increase in the power or dimensions of the limbs or any of the external organs, would more or less affect their mode of procuring food or the range of country which they inhabit. It is also evident that most changes would affect either favorably or adversely the powers of prolonging existence. An antelope with shorter or weaker legs must necessarily suffer more from the attacks of the feline carnivora. The passenger pigeon with less powerful wings would sooner or later be affected in its powers of procuring a regular supply of food, and in both cases the result must necessarily be a diminution of the population of the modified species. If, on the other hand, any species should produce a variety having slightly increased powers of preserving existence, that variety must inevitably in time acquire a superiority in numbers. These results must follow as surely as old age, intemperance, or scarcity of food produce an increased mortality. In both cases, there may be many individual exceptions, but on the average the rule will invariably be found to hold good. All varieties will therefore fall into 2 classes: those which under the same conditions would never reach the population of the parent species, and those which would in time obtain and keep a numerical superiority. Now let some alteration of physical conditions occur in the district, a long period of drought, a destruction of vegetation by locusts, the eruption of some new carnivorous animal seeking pastures new, any change in fact tending to render existence more difficult to the species in question, and tasking its utmost powers to avoid complete extermination, it is evident that of all the individuals composing the species, those forming the least numerous and most feebly organized variety would suffer first and were the pressure severe, must soon become extinct. The same causes continuing in action, the parent species would next suffer, would gradually diminish in numbers, and with a recurrence of similar unfavorable conditions might also become extinct. The superior variety would then alone remain, and on a return to favorable circumstances, would rapidly increase in numbers and occupy the place of the extinct species and variety. The variety would now have replaced the species, of which it would be a more perfectly developed and more highly organized form. It would be in all respects better adapted to secure its safety, and to prolong its individual existence and that of the race. Such a variety could not return to the original form, for that form is an inferior one, and could never compete with it for existence. Granted, therefore, a tendency to reproduce the original type of the species, still the variety must ever remain preponderant in numbers, and under adverse physical conditions again alone survive. But this new improved and populous race might itself, in course of time, give rise to new varieties, exhibiting several diverging modifications of form, any of which, tending to increase the facilities for preserving existence, must, by the same general law in their turn, become predominant. Here then we have progression and continued divergence deduced from the general laws which regulate the existence of animals in a state of nature, and from the undisputed fact that varieties do frequently occur. It is not, however, contended that this result would be invariable. A change of physical conditions in the district might at times materially modify it, rendering the race which had been the most capable of supporting existence under the former conditions now the least so, and even causing the extinction of the newer and for a time superior race, while the older parent species and its first inferior varieties continued to flourish. Variations in unimportant parts might also occur, having no perceptible effect on the life-preserving powers, and the variety so furnished might run a course parallel with the parent species, either giving rise to further variations or returning to the former type. All we argue for is that certain varieties have a tendency to maintain their existence longer than the original species, and this tendency must make itself felt. For though the doctrine of chances or averages can never be trusted to on a limited scale, yet if applied to high numbers, the results come nearer to what theory demands, and as we approach to an infinity of examples, become strictly accurate. Now the scale on which nature works is so vast, the numbers of individuals and periods of time with which she deals approach so near to infinity, that any cause, however slight, and however liable to be veiled and counteracted by accidental circumstances, must in the end produce its full legitimate results. Let us now turn to domesticated animals, and inquire how varieties produced among them are affected by the principles here enunciated. The essential difference in the condition of wild and domestic animals is this, that among the former, their well-being and very existence depend upon the full exercise and healthy condition of all their senses and physical powers, whereas among the latter, these are only partially exercised and in some cases are absolutely unused. A wild animal has to search and often to labor for every mouthful of food, to exercise sight, hearing, and smell in seeking it, and in avoiding dangers, in procuring shelter from the inclemency of the seasons, and in providing for the subsistence and safety of its offspring. There is no muscle of its body that is not called into daily and hourly activity. There is no sense or faculty that is not strengthened by continual exercise. The domestic animal, on the other hand, has food provided for it, is sheltered and often confined, to guard it against the vicissitudes of the seasons, is carefully secured from the attacks of its natural enemies, and seldom even rears its young without human assistance. Half of its senses and faculties are quite useless, and the other half are but occasionally called into feeble exercise, while even its muscular system is only irregularly called into action. Now when a variety of such an animal occurs, having increased power or capacity in any organ or sense, such increase is totally useless, is never called into action, and may even exist without the animal ever becoming aware of it. In the wild animal, on the contrary, all its faculties and powers being brought into full action for the necessities of existence, any increase becomes immediately available if strengthened by exercise, and must even slightly modify the food, the habits, and the whole economy of the race. It creates, as it were, a new animal, one of superior powers, and which will necessarily increase in numbers and outlive those inferior to it. Again, in the domesticated animal, all variations have an equal chance of continuance, and those which would decidedly render a wild animal unable to compete with its fellows and continue its existence are no disadvantage whatever in a state of domesticity. Our quickly fattening pigs, short-legged sheep, pouter pigeons, and poodle dogs could never have come into existence in a state of nature, because the very first step towards such inferior forms would have led to the rapid extinction of the race. Still less could they now exist in competition with their wild allies. The great speed but slight endurance of the racehorse, the unwieldy strength of the plowman's team, would both be useless in a state of nature. If turned wild on the pampas, such animals would probably soon become extinct, or under favorable circumstances might each lose those extreme qualities which would never be called into action, and in a few generations would revert to a common type, which must be that in which the various powers and faculties are so proportioned to each other as to be best adapted to procure food and secure safety, that in which by the full exercise of every part of his organization the animal can alone continue to live. Domestic varieties, when turned wild, must return to something near the type of the original wild stock, or become altogether extinct. We see, then, that no inferences as to varieties in a state of nature can be deduced from the observation of those occurring among domestic animals. The two are so much opposed to each other in every circumstance of their existence, that what applies to the one is almost sure not to apply to the other. Domestic animals are abnormal, irregular, artificial. They are subject to varieties which never occur, and never can occur in a state of nature. Their very existence depends altogether on human care. So far are many of them removed from that just proportion of faculties, that true balance of organization, by means of which alone an animal left to its own resources can preserve its existence and continue its race. The hypothesis of Lamarck, that progressive changes in species have been produced by the attempts of animals to increase the development of their own organs and thus modify their structure and habits, has been repeatedly and easily refuted by all writers on the subject of varieties in species. And it seems to have been considered that when this was done the whole question has been finally settled, but the view here developed renders such an hypothesis quite unnecessary, by showing that similar results must be produced by the action of principles constantly at work in nature. The powerful retractile talons of the falcon and the cat tribes have not been produced or increased by the volition of those animals, but among the different varieties which occurred in the earlier and less highly organized forms of these groups. Those always survived longest which had the greatest facilities for seizing their prey. Neither did the giraffe acquire its long neck by desiring to reach the foliage of the more lofty shrubs, and constantly stretching its neck for the purpose, but because any varieties which occurred among its antitypes with a longer neck than usual at once secured a fresh range of pasture over the same ground as their shorter-necked companions, and on the first scarcity of food were thereby enabled to outlive them. Even the peculiar colors of many animals, especially insects, so closely resembling the soil or the leaves or the trunks on which they habitually reside, are explained on the same principle. For though in the course of ages varieties of many tints have occurred, yet those races having colors best adapted to concealment from their enemies would inevitably survive the longest. We have also here an acting cause to account for that balance so often observed in nature. A deficiency in one set of organs always being compensated by an increased development of some others. Powerful wings accompanying weak feet, or great velocity making up for the absence of defensive weapons. For it has been shown that all varieties in which an unbalanced deficiency occurred could not long continue their existence. The action of this principle is exactly like that of the centrifugal governor of the steam engine, which checks and corrects any irregularities almost before they become evident. And in like manner, no unbalanced deficiency in the animal kingdom can ever reach any conspicuous magnitude, because it would make itself felt at the very first step, by rendering existence difficult and extinction almost sure soon to follow. An origin such as is here advocated will also agree with the peculiar character of the modifications of form and structure, which obtain in organized beings, the many lines of divergence from a central type, the increasing efficiency and power of a particular organ through a succession of allied species, and the remarkable persistence of unimportant parts such as color, texture of plumage and hair, form of horns or crests, through a series of species differing considerably in more essential characters. It also furnishes us with a reason for that more specialized structure, which Professor Owen states to be a characteristic of recent compared with extinct forms, and which would evidently be the result of the progressive modification of any organ applied to a special purpose in the animal economy. We believe we have now shown that there is a tendency in nature to the continued progression of certain classes of varieties, a progression to which there appears no reason to assign any definite limits, and that the same principle which produces this result in a state of nature will also explain why domestic varieties have a tendency to revert to the original type. This progression, by minute steps in various directions, but always checked and balanced by the necessary conditions, subject to which alone existence can be preserved, may, it is believed, be followed out so as to agree with all the phenomena presented by organized beings, their extinction and succession in past ages, and all the extraordinary modifications of form, instinct, and habits which they exhibit. Turnit, February 1858. Section 7. A brief life sketch of Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, by James Marchant. Introduction. In Westminster Abbey there repose almost side by no conscious design, yet with deep significance, the mortal remains of Isaac Newton and of Charles Darwin. The origin of species, said Wallace, will live as long as the Principia of Newton. Nearby are the tombs of Sir John Herschel, Lord Kelvin, and Sir Charles Lyell, and the medallions in memory of Joule, Darwin, Stokes, and Adams have been rearranged so as to admit similar memorials of Lister, Hooker, and Alfred Russel Wallace. Now that the plan is completed, Darwin and Wallace are together in this wonderful galaxy of the great men of science of the 19th century. Several illustrious names are missing from this eminent company, foremost amongst them being that of Herbert Spencer, the lofty master of that synthetic philosophy which seemed to his disciples to have the proportions and qualities of an enduring moment, and whose incomparable fertility of creative thought entitled him to share the throne with Darwin. It was Spencer, Darwin, Wallace, Hooker, Lyell, and Huxley who led that historic movement which garnered the work of Lamarck and Buffon and gave new direction to the ceaseless interrogation of nature to discover the how and the why of the august progression of life. Looking over the long list of the departed whose names are enshrined in our minster, one has sorrowfully to observe that contemporary opinion of their place in history and abiding worth was not infrequently astray, that memory has indeed forgotten their works, and their memorials might be removed to some cloister without loss of respect for the dead, perhaps even with the silent approval of their own day and generation, could it awake from its endless sleep and review the strange and eventful course of human life since they left this bank and shoal of time. But may it not be safely prophesied that of all the names on the starry scroll of national fame, that of Charles Darwin will surely remain unquestioned, and entwine with this enduring memory by right of worth and work, and we know with Darwin's fullest approval, our successors will discover the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin and Wallace were preeminent sons of light. Among the great men of the Victorian age, Wallace occupied a unique position. He was the co-discoverer of the illuminating theory of natural selection. He watched its struggle for recognition against prejudice, ignorance, ridicule, and misrepresentation, its gradual adoption by its traditional enemies, and its final supremacy. And he lived beyond the hour of its signal triumph and witnessed the further advance into the same field of research of other patient investigators, who are disclosing fresh phases of the same fundamental laws of development, and are accumulating a vast array of new facts, which tell us of still richer light to come to enlighten every man born into the world. To have lived through that brilliant period and into the second decade of the 20th century, to have outlived all contemporaries, having been the co-revealer of the greatest and most far-reaching generalization in an era which abounded in fruitful discoveries and in revolutionary advances in the application of science to life, is verily to have been the chosen of the gods. Who and what manner of man was Alfred Russel Wallace? Who were his forebears? How did he obtain his insight into the closest secrets of nature? What was the extent of his contributions to our stock of human knowledge? In which directions did he most influence his age? What is known of his inner life? These are some of the questions which most present-day readers and all future readers into whose hands this book may come will ask. As to his descent, his upbringing, his education, and his estimate of his own character and work, we can with rare good fortune refer them to his autobiography, in which he tells his own story and relates the circumstances which, combined with his natural disposition, led him to be a great naturalist and a courageous social reformer. Nay more, his autobiography is also in part a peculiar revelation of the inner man such as no biography could approach. We are also able to send inquirers to the biographies and works of his contemporaries, Darwin, Hooker, Lyell, Huxley, and many others. All this material is already available to the diligent reader, but there are other sources of information which the present book discloses. Wallace's home life, the large collection of his own letters, the reminiscences of friends, communications which he received from many co-workers, and correspondence which, besides being of interest in themselves, often cast a sidelight upon his own mind and work. All these are of peculiar and intimate value to those who desire to form a complete estimate of Wallace. And it is to help the reader to achieve this desirable result that the present work is published. It may be stated here that Wallace had suggested to the present writer that he should undertake a new work to be called Darwin and Wallace, which was to have been a comparative study of their literary and scientific writings, with an estimate of the present position of the theory of natural selection as an adequate explanation of the process of organic evolution. Wallace had promised to give as much assistance as possible in selecting the material, without which the task on such a scale would obviously have been impossible. Alas, soon after the agreement with the publishers was signed, and in the very month that the plan of the work was to have been shown to Wallace, his hand was unexpectedly stilled in death, and the book remains unwritten. But as the names of Darwin and Wallace are inseparable, even by the scythe of time, a slight attempt is here made, in the first sections of Part 1 and Part 2, to take note of their ancestry and the diversities and similarities in their respective characters and environments, social and educational, to mark the chief characteristics of their literary works and the more salient conditions and events which led them independently to the idea of natural selection. Finally, it may be remarked that up to the present time the unique work and position of Wallace have not been fully disclosed owing to his great modesty and to the fact that he outlived all his contemporaries. "I am afraid," wrote Sir W.T. Thistleton Dyer to him in one of his letters in 1893, "the splendid modesty of the big men will be a rarer commodity in the future. No doubt many of the younger ones know an immense deal, but I doubt if many of them will ever exhibit the grasp of great principles which we owe to you and your splendid band of contemporaries. If this work helps to preserve the records of the influence and achievements of this illustrious and versatile genius and of the other eminent men who brought the great conception of evolution to light, it will surely have justified its existence. 1. Wallace and Darwin, Early Years. As springs burst forth, now here, now there, on the mountainside, and find their way together to the vast ocean, so at certain periods of history, men destined to become great are born within a few years of each other, and in the course of life meet and mingle their varied gifts of soul and intellect for the ultimate benefit of mankind. Between the years 1807 and 1825, at least 8 illustrious scientists saw the light. Sir Charles Lyell, Sir Joseph Hooker, T.H. Huxley, Herbert Spencer, John Tyndall, Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Louis Agassiz, whilst among statesmen and authors we recall Bismarck, Gladstone, Lincoln, Tennyson, Longfellow, Robert and Elizabeth Browning, Ruskin, John Stuart Blackie, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, a wonderful galaxy of shining names. The first group is the one with which we are closely associated in this section, in which we have brought together the names of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, between whose births there was a period of 14 years, Darwin being born on the 12th of February, 1809, and Wallace on the 8th of January, 1823. In each case we are indebted to an autobiography for an account of their early life and work, written almost entirely from memory when at an age which enabled them to take an unbiased view of the past. The autobiography of Darwin was written for the benefit of his family only when he was 67, while the 2 large volumes entitled My Life were written by Wallace when he was 82, for the pleasure of reviewing his long career. These records are characterized by that charming modesty and simplicity of life and manner which was so marked a feature of both men. In the circumstances surrounding their early days, there was very little to indicate the similarity in character and mental gifts which became so evident in their later years. A brief outline of the hereditary influences immediately affecting them will enable us to trace something of the essential differences as well as the similarities which marked their scientific and literary attainments. The earliest records of the Darwin family show that in 1500, an ancestor of that name, though spelt differently, was a substantial yeoman living on the borders of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. In the reign of James I, the post of yeoman of the Royal Armoury of Greenwich was granted to William Darwin, whose son served with the Royalist army under Charles I. During the Commonwealth, however, he became a barrister of Lincoln's Inn and later the recorder of the city of Lincoln. Passing over a generation, we find that a brother of Dr. Erasmus Darwin cultivated botany, and when far advanced in years published a volume entitled Principia Botanica, while Erasmus developed into a poet and philosopher. The eldest son of the latter inherited a strong taste for various branches of science, and at a very early age collected specimens of all kinds. The youngest son, Robert Waring, father of Charles Darwin, became a successful physician, a man of genial temperament, strong character, fond of society, and was the possessor of great psychic power by which he could readily sum up the characters of others and even occasionally read their thoughts. A judicious use of this gift was frequently found to be more efficacious than actual medicine. To the end of his life, Charles Darwin entertained the greatest affection and reverence for his father, and frequently spoke of him to his own children. From this brief summary of the family history, it is easy to perceive the inherited traits which were combined in the attractive personality of the great scientist. From his early forebears came the keen love of sport and outdoor exercise, to which considerable reference is made in his youth and early manhood. The close application of the philosopher and the natural aptitude for collecting specimens of all kinds. To his grandfather he was doubtless indebted for his poetic imagination, which, consciously or unconsciously, pervaded his thoughts and writings, saving them from the cold scientific atmosphere which often chills the lay mind. Lastly, the geniality of his father was strongly evidenced by his own love of social intercourse, his courtesy and ready wit, whilst the gentleness of his mother, who unfortunately died when he was 7 years old, left a delicacy of feeling which pervaded his character to the very last. No such sure mental influences reaching back through several generations can be traced in the records of the Wallace family, although what is known reveals the source of the dogged perseverance with which Wallace faced the immense difficulties met with by all early pioneer travelers of that happy diversity of mental interests which helped to relieve his periods of loneliness and inactivity, and of that quiet determination to pursue to the utmost limit every idea which impressed his mind as containing the germ of a wider and more comprehensive truth than had yet been generally recognized and accepted. The innate reticence and shyness of manner, which were noticeable all through his life, covered a large heartedness even in the most careful observation of facts, and produced a tolerant disposition towards his fellow men, even when he most disagreed with their views or dogmas. He was one of those of whom it may be truly said in hackneyed phrases that he was born great, whilst destined to have greatness thrust upon him in the shape of honors which he received with hesitation. From his autobiography, we gather that his father, though dimly tracing his descent from the famous Wallace of Stirling, was born at Hanworth in Middlesex, where there appears to have been a small colony of residents bearing the same name, but occupying varied social positions, from admiral to hotel keeper, the grandfather of Alfred Russel Wallace being known as a victualler. Thomas Vere Wallace was the only son of this worthy innkeeper, and being possessed of somewhat wider ambitions than a country life offered, was articled to a solicitor in London, and eventually became an attorney at law. On his father's death he inherited a small private income, and not being of an energetic disposition, he preferred to live quietly on it instead of continuing his practice. His main interests were somewhat literary and artistic, but without any definite aim, and this lack of natural energy, mental and physical, reappeared in most of the 9 children subsequently born to him, including Alfred Russel, who realized that had it not been for the one definite interest which gradually determined his course in life, an interest demanding steady perseverance and concentrated thought as well as physical enterprise, his career might easily have been much less useful. It was undoubtedly from his father that he acquired an appreciation of good literature, as they were in the habit of hearing Shakespeare and similar works read aloud round the fireside on winter nights, whilst from his mother came artistic and business-like instincts, several of her relatives having been architects of no mean skill, combining with their art sound business qualities, which placed them in positions of civic authority, and brought them the respect due to men of upright character and good parts. During the checkered experiences which followed the marriage of Thomas Vere Wallace and Mary Ann Grennell, there appears to have been complete mutual affection and understanding, although Wallace makes but slight reference to his mother's character and habits. One may readily conclude that her disposition and influence were such as to leave an indelible impression for good on the minds of her children, amongst her qualities being a talent for not merely accepting circumstances, but in a quiet way making the most of each experience as it came, a talent which we find repeated on many occasions in the life of her son Alfred. It is a little curious that each of these great scientists should have been born in a house overlooking a well-known river, the home of the Darwins standing on the banks of the Severn at Shrewsbury, and that of the Wallaces a stone's throw from the waters of the romantic and beautiful Usk of Monmouthshire. With remarkable clearness, Dr. Wallace could recall events and scenes back to the time when he was only 4 years of age. His first childish experiment occurred about that time, due to his being greatly impressed by the story of the fox and the pitcher in Aesop's fables. Finding a jar standing in the yard outside their house, he promptly proceeded to pour a small quantity of water into it, and then added a handful of small stones, the water not rising to the surface as it did in the fable. He found a spade and scraped up a mixture of earth and pebbles, which he added to the stones already in the jar. The result, however, proving quite unsatisfactory, he gave up the experiment in disgust, and refused to believe in the truth of the fable. His restless brain and vivid imagination at this early period is shown by some dreams which he could still recall when 82 years of age. Whilst the strong impression left on his mind by certain localities, with all their graphic detail of form and color, enabled him to enjoy over again many of the simple pleasures that made up his early life in the beautiful grounds of the ancient castle in which he used to play. The first great event in his life was the journey undertaken by ferryboat and stagecoach from Usk to Hartford, to which town the family removed when he was 6 years old, and where they remained for the next 8 years until he left school. The morning after their arrival an incident occurred which left its trace as of a slender golden thread running throughout the fabric of his long life. Alfred, with childlike curiosity about his new surroundings, wandered into the yard behind their house and presently heard a voice coming from the other side of the low wall saying, "Hello, who are you?" and saw a boy about his own age peering over the top. Explanations followed, and soon, by the aid of 2 water butts, the small boys found themselves sitting side by side on the top of the wall, holding a long and intimate conversation. Thus began his friendship with George Silk, and by some curious trend of circumstances, the 2 families became neighbors on several subsequent occasions, so that the friendship was maintained until in due course the boys separated, each to his own way in life, the one to wander in foreign lands, the other to occupy a responsible position at home. After spending about a year at private schools, Alfred Wallace was sent with his brother John to Hartford Grammar School. His recollections of these school days are full of interest, especially as contrasted with the school life of today. He says, "We went to school even in the winter at 7 in the morning, and 3 days a week remained till 5 in the afternoon. Some artificial light was necessary, and this was effected by the primitive method of every boy bringing his own candle or candle ends, with any kind of candlestick he liked. An empty ink bottle was often used, or the candle was even stuck onto the desk with a little of its own grease, so that it enabled us to learn our lessons or do our sums. No one seemed to trouble about how we provided the light. Though never robust in health, he enjoyed all the usual boyish sports, especially such as appealed to his imagination and love of adventure. Not far from the school, a natural cave, formed in a chalky slope and partially concealed by undergrowth, made an excellent resort for brigands, and to this hiding place were brought potatoes and other provisions, which could be cooked and eaten in primitive fashion, with an air of secrecy which added to the mystery and attraction of the boyish adventure. It is curious to note that one destined to become a great traveler and explorer should have found the study of geography a painful subject, but this was, as he afterwards understood, entirely due to the method of teaching then, and sometimes now in vogue, which made no appeal whatever to the imagination by creating a mental picture of the peoples and nations, or the varied wonders and beauties of nature which distinguish one country from another. No interesting facts were ever given, no accounts of the country by travelers were ever read, no good maps ever given us, nothing but the horrid stream of unintelligible place names to be learnt. The only subjects in which he considered that he gained some valuable grounding at school were Latin, arithmetic, and writing. This estimate of the value of the grammar school teaching is echoed in Darwin's own words when describing his school days at precisely the same age at Shrewsbury Grammar School, where he says, "The school as a means of education to me was simply a blank." It is therefore interesting to notice side by side, as it were, the occupation which each boy found for himself out of school hours, and which in both instances proved of immense value in their respective careers in later life. Darwin, even at this early age, found his taste for natural history, and more especially for collecting, well developed. "I tried," he says, "to make out the names of plants, and collected all sorts of things, shells, seals, franks, coins, and minerals." The passion for collecting, which leads a man to be a systematic naturalist, was very strong in me, and was clearly innate, as none of my sisters or brothers ever had this taste. He also speaks of himself as having been a very simple little fellow, by the manner in which he was either himself deceived or tried to deceive others in a harmless way. As an instance of this, He remembered declaring that he could produce variously colored polyanthonyes and primroses by watering them with certain colored fluids, though he knew all the time it was untrue. His feeling of tenderness towards all animals and insects is revealed in the fact that he could not remember, except on one occasion, ever taking more than one egg out of a bird's nest, and though a keen angler, as soon as he heard that he could kill the worms with salt and water, he never afterwards spitted a living worm, though at the expense probably of some loss of success. Nothing thwarted young Darwin's intense joy and interest in collecting minerals and insects, and in watching and making notes upon the habits of birds. In addition to this wholesome outdoor hobby, the tedium of school lessons was relieved for him by reading Shakespeare, Byron, and Scott. Also a copy of Wonders of the World, which belonged to one of the boys, and to which he always attributed his first desire to travel in remote countries, little thinking how his dreams would be fulfilled. Whilst Charles Darwin occupied himself with outdoor sport and collecting, with a very moderate amount of reading thrown in at intervals, Wallace, on the contrary, devoured all the books he could get, and fortunately for him, his father having been appointed librarian to the Harfordtown Library, Alfred had access to all the books that appealed to his mental appetite, and these, especially the historical novels, supplemented the lack of interesting history lessons at school, besides giving him an insight into many kinds of literature suited to his varied taste and temperament. In addition, however, to the hours spent in reading, he and his brother John found endless delight in turning the loft of an outhouse adjoining their yard into a sort of mechanical factory. Here they contrived, by saving up all their pence, the only pocket money that came to them, to make crackers and other simple fireworks, and to turn old keys into toy cannon, besides making a large variety of articles for practical domestic purposes. Thus he cultivated the gift of resourcefulness and self-reliance, on which he had so often to depend when far removed from all civilization, during his travels on the Amazon and in the Malay archipelago. A somewhat amusing instance of this is found in a letter to his sister dated June 25, 1855, at a time when he wanted a really capable man for his companion, in place of the good-natured but incapable boy Charles, whom he had brought with him from London to teach collecting. In reply to some remarks by his sister about a young man who she thought would be suitable, he wrote, "Do not tell me merely that he is a very nice young man. Of course he is. I should like to know whether he can live on rice and salt fish for a week on occasion. Can he sleep on a board? Can he walk 20 miles a day? Whether he can work, for there is sometimes as hard work in collecting as in anything. Can he saw a piece of wood straight? Ask him to make you anything, a little card box, a wooden peg or bottle stopper, and see if he makes them neat and square." He describes the garden and livestock he had been able to obtain where he was living, and in yet another he gives a long list of his domestic woes and tribulations, which, however, were overcome with the patience inculcated in his early life by his hobbies, and also by the fact that the family was always more or less in straitened circumstances, so that the children were taught to make themselves useful in various ways in order to assist their mother in the home. As he grew from childhood into youth, Alfred Wallace's extreme sensitiveness developed to an almost painful degree. He grew rapidly, and his unusual height made him still more shy when forced to occupy any prominent position amongst boys of his own age. During the latter part of his time at Harford Grammar School, his father was unable to pay the usual fees, and it was agreed that Alfred should act as pupil-teacher in return for the lessons received. This arrangement, while acceptable on the one hand, caused him actual mental and physical pain on the other, as it increased his consciousness of the disabilities under which he labored, in contrast with most of the other boys of his own age. At the age of 14, Wallace was taken away from school, and until something could be definitely decided about his future, as up to the present he had no particular bent in any one direction, he was sent to London to live with his brother John, who was then working for a master builder in the vicinity of Tottenham Court Road. This was in January 1837, and it was during the following summer that he joined his other brother, William, at Bratton on the Clay, Bedfordshire, and began land surveying. In the meantime, while in London, he had been brought very closely into contact with the economics and ethics of Robert Owen, the well-known socialist, and although very young in years, he was so deeply impressed with the reasonableness and practical outcome of these theories that, though considerably modified as time went on, they formed the foundation of his own writings on socialism and allied subjects in after years. As one of our aims in this section is to suggest an outline of the contrasting influences governing the early lives of Wallace and Darwin, it is interesting to note that at the ages of 14 and 16 respectively, and immediately on leaving school, they came under the first definite mental influence which was to shape their future thought and action. Yet how totally different from Wallace's trials as a pupil teacher was the removal of Darwin from Dr. Butler's school at Shrewsbury, because he was doing no good there, and his father thought it was time he settled down to his medical study in Edinburgh, never heeding the fact that his son had already one passion in life, apart from shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, which stood a very good chance of saving him from becoming the disgrace to the family that his good father feared. So that while Wallace was imbibing his first lessons in socialism at 14 years of age, Darwin at 16 found himself merely enduring, with a feeling of disgust, Dr. Duncan's lectures, which were something fearful to remember, on materia medica at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning, and worse still, Dr. Monroe's lectures on human anatomy, which were as dull as he was himself. Yet he always deeply regretted not having been urged to practice dissection because of the invaluable aid it would have been to him as a naturalist. By mental instinct, however, Darwin soon found himself studying marine zoology and other branches of natural science. This was in a large measure due to his intimacy with Dr. Grant, who in a later article on Flustra made some allusion to a paper read by Darwin before the Linnean Society on a small discovery which he had made by the aid of a wretched microscope, to the effect that the so-called ova of Flustra were really larvae and had the power of independent action by means of cilia. During his second year at Edinburgh, he attended Jameson's lectures on geology and zoology, but found them so incredibly dull that he determined never to study the science. Then came the final move, which all unknowingly was to lead Darwin into the pursuit of a science which up to that time had only been a hobby and not in any sense the serious profession of his life. But again, how wide the difference between his change from Edinburgh to Cambridge and that of Wallace from a month's association with a working-class socialistic community in London to land surveying under the simplest rural conditions prevalent amongst the respectable laboring farmers of Bedfordshire, Darwin to the culture and privileges of a great university with the object of becoming a clergyman, and Wallace taking the first road that offered towards earning a living, with no thought as to the ultimate outcome of this life in the open and the systematic observation of soils and land formation. But the inherent tendencies of Darwin's nature drew him away from theology to the study of geology, entomology, and botany. The ensuing 4 years at Cambridge were very happy ones. While fortunate in being able to follow his various mental and scientific pursuits with the freedom which a good social and financial position secured for him, he found himself by a natural seriousness of manner, balanced by a cheerful temperament and love of sport, the friend and companion of men many years his seniors, and holding positions of authority in the world of science. Amongst these the name of Professor Henslow will always take precedence. This friendship, says Darwin, influenced my whole career more than any other. Henslow's extensive knowledge of botany, geology, entomology, chemistry, and mineralogy, added to his sincere and attractive personality, well-balanced mind, and excellent judgment, formed a strong and effective bias in the direction Darwin was destined to follow. Apart, however, from the strong personal influence of Henslow, Sedgwick, and others with whom he came much in contact, 2 books which he read at this time aroused his burning zeal to add the most humble contribution to the noble structure of natural science. These were Sir J. Herschel's Introduction to the Study of Natural Philosophy, and Humboldt's Personal Narrative. Indeed, so fascinated was he by the description given of Tenerife in the latter, that he had once set about a plan whereby he might spend a holiday with Henslow in that locality, a holiday which was indeed to form part of his famous voyage. By means of his explorations in the neighborhood of Cambridge, and one or two visits to North Wales, Darwin's experimental knowledge of geology and allied sciences was considerably increased. In his zeal for collecting beetles, he employed a laborer to scrape the moss off old trees in winter and place it in a bag, and likewise to collect the rubbish at the bottom of the barges in which reeds were brought from the fens, and thus got some very rare species. During the summer vacation of 1831, at the personal request of Henslow, he accompanied Professor Sedgwick on a geological tour in North Wales. In order, no doubt, to give him some independent experience, Sedgwick sent Darwin on a line parallel with his own, telling him to bring back specimens of the rocks and to mark the stratification on a map. In later years, Darwin was amazed to find how much both of them had failed to observe. Yet these phenomena were so conspicuous that a house burnt down by fire could not tell its story more plainly than did the Valley of Coombe Idwal. This tour was the introduction to a momentous change in his life. On returning to Shrewsbury, he found a letter awaiting him which contained the offer of a voyage in HMS Beagle. But owing to several objections raised by Dr. Darwin, he wrote and declined the offer. And if it had not been for the immediate intervention of his uncle, Mr. Josiah Wedgwood, to whose house he went the following day to begin the shooting season, who took quite a different view of the proposition, the Journal of Researches during the Voyage of HMS Beagle by Charles Darwin would never have been written. At length, however, after much preparation and many delays, the Beagle sailed from Plymouth on December 27, 1831. And 5 years elapsed before Darwin set foot again on English soil. The period, therefore, in Darwin's life which we find covered by his term at Edinburgh and Cambridge until at the age of 22 he found himself suddenly launched on an entirely new experience, full of adventure and fresh association, was spent by Wallace in a somewhat similar manner, insofar as his outward objective in life was more or less distinct from the pursuits which gradually dawned upon his horizon, though they were followed as a thing apart, and not as an ultimate end. With Wallace's removal into Bedfordshire, an entirely new life opened up before him. His health, never very good, rapidly improved. Both brain and eye were trained to practical observations, which proved eminently valuable. His description of the people with whom he came in contact during these years of country life reveal the quiet toleration of the faults and foibles of others, not devoid of the keen sense of humor and justice which characterized his lifelong attitude towards his fellow men. The many interests of his new life, together with the use of a pocket sextant, prompted him to make various experiments for himself. The only sources from which he could obtain helpful information, however, were some cheap elementary books on mechanics and optics, which he procured from the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. These he studied and puzzled over for several years. Having no friends of my own age, he wrote, I occupied myself with various pursuits in which I had begun to take an interest. Having learnt the use of the sextant in surveying, and my brother having a book on nautical astronomy, I practiced a few of the simpler observations. Among these were determining the meridian by equal altitudes of the sun, and also by the pole star at its upper or lower culmination, finding the latitude by the meridian altitude of the sun, or of some of the principal stars, and making a rude sundial by erecting a gnomon towards the pole. For these simple calculations I had Hannay and Dietrichson's Almanac, a copious publication which gave all the important data in the Nautical Almanac, besides much other interesting matter useful for the astronomical amateur or the ordinary navigator. I also tried to make a telescope by purchasing a lens of about 2 feet focus at an optician's in Swansea, fixing it in a paper tube and using the eyepiece of a small opera glass. With it I was able to observe the Moon and Jupiter satellites, and some of the larger star clusters, but of course very imperfectly. Yet it served to increase my interest in astronomy and to induce me to study with some care the various methods of construction of the more important astronomical instruments. And it also led me throughout my life to be deeply interested in the grand onward march of astronomical discovery. At the same time, Wallace became attracted by and interested in the flowers, shrubs, and trees growing in that part of Bedfordshire, and he acquired some elementary knowledge of zoology. It was, he writes, while living at Bratton that I obtained my first information that there was such a science as geology. My brother, like most land surveyors, was something of a geologist, and he showed me the fossil oysters of the genus Graphia and the belemnites, and several other fossils which were abundant in the chalk and gravel around Bratton. It was here, too, that during my solitary rambles I first began to feel the influence of nature, and to wish to know more of the various flowers, shrubs, and trees I daily met with, but of which, for the most part, I did not even know the English names. At that time I hardly realized that there was such a science as systematic botany, that every flower and every meanest and most insignificant weed had been accurately described and classified, and that there was any kind of system or order in the endless variety of plants and animals which I knew existed. This wish to know the names of wild plants, to be able to speak about them, had arisen from a chance remark I had overheard about a year before. A lady whom we knew at Hartford was talking to some friends in the street when I and my father met them, and I heard the lady say, "We found quite a rarity the other day, the monotropa. It had not been found here before." This I pondered over and wondered what the monotropa was. All my father could tell me was that it was a rare plant, and I thought how nice it must be to know the names of rare plants when you found them. One can picture the tall, quiet boy going on these solitary rambles, his eyes becoming gradually quickened to perceive new forms in nature, contrasting them with one another, and beginning to ponder over the cause which led to the diverse formation and coloring of leaves apparently of the same family. It was in 1841, 4 years later, that he heard of, and at once procured, a book published at $1 by the SPCK, the title of which he could not recall in after years, to which he owed his first scientific glimmerings of the vast study of botany. The next step was to procure, at much self-sacrifice, Lindley's Elements of Botany, published at half a guinea, which, to his immense disappointment, he found of very little use, as it did not deal with British plants. His disappointment was lessened, however, by the loan from a Mr. Hayward of London's Encyclopedia of Plants, and it was with the help of these 2 books that he made his first classification of the specimens which he had collected and carefully kept during the few preceding years. It must be remembered, he says, in My Life, that my ignorance of plants at this time was extreme. I knew the wild rose, bramble, hawthorn, buttercup, poppy, daisy, and foxglove, and very few others equally common. I knew nothing whatever as to the genera and species, nor of the large number of distinct forms related to each, and grouped into natural orders. My delight, therefore, was great when I was able to identify the charming little eyebright, the strange-looking cowweed and lousewort, the handsome mullein, and the pretty creeping toadflax, and to find that all of them, as well as the lordly foxglove, formed parts of one great natural order, and that under all their superficial diversity of form was a similarity of structure, which, when once clearly understood, enabled me to locate each fresh species with greater ease. This, however, was not sufficient, and the last step was to form a herbarium. I soon found, he wrote, that by merely identifying the plants I found in my walks, I lost much time in gathering the same species several times, and even then not being always quite sure that I had found the same plant before. I therefore began to form a herbarium, collecting good specimens and drying them carefully between drying papers and a couple of boards weighted with books or stones. I first named the species as nearly as I could do so, and then laid them out to be pressed and dried. At such times, he continues, and I have quoted the passage for the sake of this revealing confession, I experienced the joy which every discovery of a new form of life gives to the lover of nature, almost equal to those raptures which I afterwards felt at every capture of new butterflies on the Amazon, or at the constant stream of new species of birds, beetles, and butterflies in Borneo, the Moluccas, and the Aru Islands. Anything in the shape of gardening papers and catalogues which came in his way was eagerly read, and to this source he owed his first interest in the fascinating orchid. A catalogue published by a great nurseryman in Bristol contained a number of tropical orchids, of whose wonderful variety and beauty I had obtained some idea from the woodcuts in Loudon's Encyclopedia. The first epiphytal orchid I ever saw was at a flower show in Swansea, which caused in me a thrill of enjoyment which no other plant in the show produced. My interest in this wonderful order of plants was further enhanced by reading in the Gardener's Chronicle an article by Dr. Lindley on one of the London flower shows, where there was a good display of orchids, in which he added an Dendrobium devonianum, too delicate and beautiful for a flower of earth. This and other references gave them, in my mind, a weird and mysterious charm, which I believe had its share in producing that longing for the tropics, which a few years later was satisfied in the equatorial forests of the Amazon. For a brief period, when there was a lull in the surveying business, and his prospects of continuing in this profession looked uncertain, he tried watchmaking, and would probably, though not by choice, have been apprenticed to it, but for an unexpected circumstance which caused his master to give up his business. Alfred gladly, when the occasion offered, returned to his outdoor life, which had begun to make the strongest appeal to him, stronger perhaps than he was really aware. Early in 1844, another break occurred due to the sudden falling off of land surveying as a profitable business. His brother could no longer afford to keep him as assistant, finding it indeed difficult to obtain sufficient employment for himself. As Wallace knew no other trade or profession, the only course which occurred to his mind as possible by which to earn a living was to get a post as schoolteacher. After one or two rather amusing experiences, he eventually found himself in very congenial surroundings under the Reverend Abraham Hill, headmaster of the collegiate school at Leicester. Here he stayed for a little more than a year, during which time, in addition to his schoolwork and a considerable amount of hard reading on subjects to which he had not hitherto been able to devote himself, he was led to become greatly interested in phrenology and mesmerism, and before long found himself something of an expert in giving mesmeric demonstrations before small audiences. Phrenology, he believed, proved of much value in determining his own characteristics, good and bad, and in guiding him to a wise use of the faculties which made for his ultimate success, while his introduction to mesmerism had not a little to do with his becoming interested and finally convinced of the part played by spiritualistic forces and agencies in human life. The most important event, however, during this year at Leicester was his meeting with H.W. Bates, through whom he was introduced to the absorbing study of beetles and butterflies, the link which culminated in their mutual exploration of the Amazon. It is curious that Wallace retained no distinct recollection of how or when he met Bates for the first time, but thought that he heard him mentioned as an enthusiastic entomologist and met him at the library. Bates was at this time employed by his father, who was a hosiery manufacturer, and he could therefore only devote his spare time to collecting beetles in the surrounding neighborhood. The friendship brought new interest into both lives, and though Wallace was obliged a few months later to leave Leicester and return to his old work of surveying, owing to the sudden death of his brother William, whose business affairs were left in an unsatisfactory condition and needed personal attention, he no longer found in it the satisfaction he had previously experienced, and his letters to Bates expressed the desire to strike out on some new line, one which would satisfy his craving for a definite pursuit in the direction of natural science. Somewhere around the autumn of 1847, Bates paid a visit to Wallace at Neath, and the plan to go to the Amazon, which had been slowly forming itself, at length took shape due to the perusal of a little book entitled A Voyage Up the River Amazon by W. H. Edwards. Further investigations showed that this would be particularly advantageous, as the district had only been explored by the German zoologist von Spix and the botanist von Martens in 1817 to 1820, and subsequently by Count de Castelnau. During this interval we find in a letter to Bates the following allusion to Darwin, which is the first record of Wallace's high estimate of the man with whom his own name was to be dramatically associated 10 years later. "I first," he says, "read Darwin's journal 3 or 4 years ago, and have lately reread it. As the journal of a scientific traveler, it is second only to Humboldt's narrative as a work of general interest, perhaps superior to it. He is an ardent admirer and most able supporter of Mr. Lyell's views. His style of writing I very much admire, so free from all labor or egotism, yet so full of interest and original thought." The early part of 1848 was occupied in making arrangements with Mr. Samuel Stevens of King Street, Covent Garden, to act as their agent in disposing of a duplicate collection of specimens which they proposed sending home, by this means paying their expenses during the time they were away, any surplus being invested against their return. This and other matters being satisfactorily settled, they eventually sailed from Liverpool on April 20th in a bark of 192 tons, said to be a very fast sailer, which proved to be correct. On arriving at Para about a month later, they immediately set about finding a house, learning something of the language, the habits of the people amongst whom they had come to live, and making short excursions into the forest before starting on longer and more trying explorations up country. Wallace's previous vivid imaginings of what life in the tropics would mean, so far as the surpassing beauty of nature was concerned, were not immediately fulfilled. As a starting point, however, Para had many advantages. Besides the pleasant climate, the country for some hundreds of miles was found to be nearly level at an elevation of about 30 or 40 feet above the river, the first distinct rise occurring some 150 miles up the river Tocantins, southwest of Para. The whole district was intersected by streams, with cross-channels connecting them, access by this means being comparatively easy to villages and estates lying farther inland. Before making an extensive excursion into the interior, he spent some time on the larger islands at the mouth of the Amazon, on one of which he immediately noticed the scarcity of trees, while the abundance of every kind of animal life crowded into a small space was here very striking, compared with the sparse manner in which it is scattered in the virgin forests. It seems to force us to the conclusion that the luxuriance of tropical vegetation is not favorable to the production of animal life. The plains are always more thickly peopled than the forest, and a temperate zone, as has been pointed out by Mr. Darwin, seems better adapted to the support of large land animals than the tropics. We have already referred to the fact that at the very early age of 14, Wallace had imbibed his first ideas of socialism, or how the commonwealth of a people or nation was the outcome of cause and effect, largely due to the form of government, political economy, and progressive commerce best suited to any individual state or country. The seed took deep root, and during the years spent for the most part amongst an agricultural people in England and Wales, his interest in these questions had been quickened by observation and intelligent inquiry. It is no wonder, therefore, that during the whole of his travels we find many intimate references to such matters regarding the locality in which he happened to find himself, but which can only be noticed in a very casual manner in this section. For instance, he soon discovered that the climate and soil around Para conduced to the cultivation of almost every kind of food, such as cocoa, coffee, sugar, farina, the universal bread of the country, from the mandioca plant, with vegetables and fruits in inexhaustible variety, while the articles of export included India rubber, Brazil nuts, and piaçaba, the coarse, stiff fiber of a palm, used for making brooms for street sweeping, as well as sarsaparilla, balsam capivi, and a few other drugs. The utter lack of initiative or even ordinary interest in making the most of the opportunities lying at hand struck him again and again as he went from place to place and was entertained hospitably by hosts of various nationalities, until at times the impression is conveyed that apart from his initial interest as a naturalist, a longing seized him to arouse those who were primarily responsible for these conditions out of the apathy into which they had fallen, and to make them realize the larger pleasure which life offers to those who recognize the opportunities at hand, not only for their own advancement, but also for the benefit of those placed under their control, all of which we find happily illustrated during his visit to Sarawak in the Malay archipelago. The whole of these 4 years was crowded with valuable experiences of one sort and another. Some of the most toilsome journeys proved only a disappointment, while others brought success beyond his most sanguine dreams. At the end of 2 years it was agreed between himself and Bates that they should separate, Wallace doing the northern parts and tributaries of the Amazon, and Bates the main stream, which from the fork of the Rio Negro is called the Upper Amazon, or the Solomons. By this arrangement they were able to cover more ground, besides devoting themselves to the special goal of research on which each was bent. In the meantime Wallace's younger brother Herbert had come out to join him, and for some time their journeys were made conjointly. But finding that his brother was not temperamentally fitted to become a naturalist, it was decided that he should return to England. Accordingly they parted at Barra, when Wallace started on his long journey up the Rio Negro, the duration of which was uncertain, and it was not until many months after the sad event that he heard the distressing news that Herbert had died of yellow fever on the eve of his departure from Para for home. Fortunately, Bates was in Para at the time, and did what he could for the boy until stricken down himself with the same sickness, from which, however, his stronger constitution enabled him to recover. Perhaps the most eventful and memorable journey during this period was the exploration of the Wapez River, of which Wallace wrote nearly 60 years later. So far as I have heard, no English traveler has to this day ascended the Wapez River so far as I did, and no collector has stayed at any time at Avita, or has even passed through it. From a communication received from the Royal Geographical Society, it appears that the first complete survey of this river, a compass traverse supplemented by astronomical observations, was made 1907 to 1908 by Dr. Hamilton Rice, starting from the side of Columbia and tracing the whole course of the river from a point near the source of its headstream. The result showed that the general course of the lower river was much as represented by Wallace, though considerable corrections were necessary both in latitude and longitude. I am assured by authorities on the Rio Negro region, writes Dr. Scott Kelty to Mr. W. G. Wallace under date May 21, 1915, that your father's work still holds good. In May 1852, Wallace returned to Para and sailed for England the following July. The ship took fire at sea, and all his treasures, not previously sent to England, were unhappily lost. 10 days and nights were spent in an open boat before another vessel picked them up, and in describing this terrible experience he says, "When the danger appeared past, I began to feel the greatness of my loss. With what pleasure had I looked upon every rare and curious insect I had added to my collection! How many times, when almost overcome by the ague, had I crawled into the forest and been rewarded by some unknown and beautiful species! How many places, which no European foot but my own had trodden, would have been recalled to my memory by the rare birds and insects they had furnished to my collection! How many weary days and weeks had I passed upheld only by the fond hope of bringing home many new and beautiful forms from these wild regions, which would prove that I had not wasted the advantage I had enjoyed and would give me occupation and amusement for many years to come. And now I had not one specimen to illustrate the unknown lands I had trod, or to call back the recollection of the wild scenes I had beheld. But such regrets were vain, and I tried to occupy myself with the state of things which actually existed. On reaching London, Wallace took a house in Upper Albany Street, where his mother and his married sister, Mrs. Sims, with her husband, a photographer, came to live with him. The next 18 months were fully occupied with sorting and arranging such collections as had previously reached England, writing his book of travels up the Amazon and Rio Negro, published in the autumn of 1853, and a little book on the palm trees based on a number of fine pencil sketches he had preserved in a tin box, the only thing saved from the wreck. In summing up the most vivid impressions left on his mind apart from purely scientific results, after his 4 years in South America he wrote that the feature which he could never think of without delight was the wonderful variety and exquisite beauty of the butterflies and birds, ever new and beautiful, strange and even mysterious, so that he could hardly recall them without a thrill of admiration and wonder. But the most unexpected sensation of surprise and delight was my first meeting and living with man in a state of nature, with absolute uncontaminated savages. And the surprise of it was that I did not expect to be at all so surprised. These true wild Indians of the Wapez had nothing that we call clothes. They had peculiar ornaments, tribal marks, etc. They all carried tools or weapons of their own manufacture. But more than all, their whole aspect and manner was different. They were all going about their own work or pleasure, which had nothing to do with white men or their ways. They walked with the free step of the independent forest dweller, and, except the few that were known to my companion, paid no attention whatever to us, mere strangers of an alien race. In every detail they were original and self-sustaining, as are the wild animals of the forest, absolutely independent of civilization. I could not have believed that there would have been so much difference in the aspect of the same people in their native state and when living under European supervision. The true denizen of the Amazonian forest, like the forest itself, is unique and not to be forgotten. The foregoing impressions recall forcibly those expressed by Darwin in similar terms at the close of his journal. Delight is a weak term to express the feelings of a naturalist who, for the first time, has wandered by himself in a Brazilian forest. The elegance of the grasses, the novelty of the parasitical plants, the beauty of the flowers, the glossy green of the foliage, the general luxuriance of the vegetation, filled me with admiration. A paradoxical mixture of sound and silence pervades the shady parts of the wood, yet within the recesses a universal silence appears to reign. Such a day as this brings with it a deeper pleasure than he, a naturalist, can ever hope to experience again. And in another place, among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none can exceed in sublimity the primeval forests, undefaced by the hand of man, temples, filled with the various productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved, and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. In complete contrast to the forest, the bare, treeless, and uninhabited plains of Patagonia frequently crossed before Darwin's eyes. Why he could not understand, except that, being so boundless, they left free scope for the imagination. As these travels, undertaken at comparatively the same age, represent the foundation upon which their scientific work and theories were based during the long years which followed, a glance at the conditions governing the separate expeditions, both mental and physical, may be of some value. The most obvious difference lies perhaps in the fact that Darwin was free from the thought of having to pay his way by the immediate result of his efforts, and likewise from all care and anxiety regarding domestic concerns, the latter being provided for him when on board the Beagle, or arranged by those who accompanied him on his travels overland and by river. The elimination of these minor cares tended to leave his mind free and open to absorb and speculate at comparative leisure upon all these strange phenomena which presented themselves throughout the long voyage. A further point of interest in determining the ultimate gain or loss lies in the fact that Darwin's private excursions had to be somewhat subservient to the movements of the Beagle under the command of Captain Fitzroy. This, in all probability, was beneficial to one of his temperament, unaccustomed to being greatly restricted by outward circumstances or conditions, though never flagrantly or perhaps consciously going against them. The same applies in a measure to Wallace, who on more than one occasion confessed his tendency to a feeling of semi-idleness and dislike to any form of enforced physical exertion. But as every detail involving constant forethought and arrangement, as well as the execution, devolved upon himself, the latent powers of methodical perseverance, which never failed him, no matter what difficulties barred his way, were called forth. Darwin's estimate of the habit of mind forced upon himself during this period may not inaptly be applied to both men. Everything about which I had thought or read was made to bear directly on what I had seen or was likely to see, and this habit of mine was continuing during the 5 years of the voyage. I feel sure that it was this training which enabled me to do whatever I have done in science. It may be further assumed that Darwin was better equipped mentally from a scientific point of view, owing to his personal intercourse with eminent scientific men previous to his assuming this responsible position. Wallace, on the contrary, had practically little beyond book knowledge and such experience as he had been able to gain by solitary wanderings in the localities in which he had by circumstances been forced to reside. His plan of operations must therefore have been largely modified and adapted as time went on, and as his finances allowed. To both, therefore, credit is due for the adaptability evinced under conditions not always congenial or conducive to the pursuits they had undertaken. Although the fact is not definitely stated by Wallace, it may readily be inferred that the idea of making this the starting point of a new life was clearly in his mind, while Darwin simply accepted the opportunity when it came, and was only brought to a consciousness of its full meaning and bearing on his future career while studying the geological aspect of Santiago, when the line of white rock revealed a new and important fact, namely, that there had been afterwards subsidence around the craters, which had since been in action and had poured forth lava. It then, he says, first dawned on me that I might perhaps write a book on the geology of the various countries visited, and this made me thrill with delight. That was a memorable hour to me, and how distinctly I can call to mind the low cliff of lava beneath which I rested, with the sun glaring hot, a few strange desert plants growing near, and with living corals in the tidal pools at my feet. Another point of comparison lies in the fact that at no time did the study of man or human nature from the metaphysical and psychological point of view appeal to Darwin as it did to Wallace. And this being so, the similarity between the impression made on them individually by their first contact with primitive human beings is of some interest. Wallace's words have already been quoted. Here are Darwin's. Nothing is more certain to create astonishment than the first sight in his native haunt of a barbarian, of man in his lowest and most savage state. One asks, could our progenitors have been men like these, men whose very signs and expressions are less intelligible to us than those of the domesticated animals, men who do not possess the instinct of those animals, nor yet appear to boast of human reason, or at least of arts consequent on that reason? I do not believe it is possible to describe or paint the difference between a savage and civilized man. It is the difference between a wild and tame animal. The last word suggests the seed thought eventually to be enlarged in the descent of man, and there is also perhaps a subtle suggestion of the points in which Wallace differed from Darwin when the time came for them to discuss this important section of the theory of evolution. It needed, however, the further 8 years spent by Wallace in the Malay archipelago to bring about a much wider knowledge of natural science before he was prepared in any way to assume the position of exponent of theories not seriously thought of previously in the scientific world. In the autumn of 1853, on the completion of his travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, Wallace paid his first visit to Switzerland on a walking tour in company with his friend George Silk. On his return and during the winter months, he was constant in his attendance at the meetings of the entomological and zoological societies. It was at one of these evening gatherings that he first met Huxley. and he also had a vague recollection of once meeting and speaking to Darwin at the British Museum. Had it not been for his extreme shyness of disposition and, according to his own estimation, lack of conversational powers, he would doubtless have become far more widely known, and have enjoyed the friendship of not a few of the eminent men who shared his interests during this interval before starting on his journey to Singapore. It was due to his close study of the insect and bird departments of the British Museum that he decided on Singapore as a new starting point for his natural history collections. As the region was generally healthy and no part of it, with the exception of the island of Java, had been explored, it offered unlimited attractions for his special work. But as the journey out would be an expensive one, he was advised to lay his plans before Sir Roderick Murchison, then president of the Royal Geographical Society, and it was through his kindly interest and personal application to the government that a passage was provided in one of the P&O boats going to Singapore. He left early in 1854. Arrived at Singapore, an entirely new world opened up before him. New peoples and customs thronged on all hands, a medley of nationalities such as can only be seen in the East, where even today, and though forming part of one large community, each section preserves its native dress, customs, and religious habits. After spending some time in Singapore, he moved from place to place, but finally decided upon making Ternate his headquarters, as he discovered a comfortable bungalow not too large, and adaptable in every way as a place in which to collect and prepare his specimens between the many excursions to other parts of the archipelago. The name is now indelibly associated with that particular visit, which ended after a trying journey in an attack of intermittent fever and general prostration, during which he first conceived the idea which has made Ternate famous in the history of natural science. One or two points in the following letters recall certain contrasts similar to those already drawn between Darwin's impression of places and people and those made on the mind of Wallace by practically the same conditions. A typical instance is found in their estimate of the life and work of the missionaries whom they met and from whom they received the warmest hospitality. Their experience included both Protestant and Roman Catholic, and from Darwin's account the former appeared to him to have the more civilizing effect on the people, not only from a religious but also from the economic and industrial points of view. In the Journal, page 419, we find a detailed account of a visit to the missionary settlement at Waimate, New Zealand. After describing the familiar English appearance of the whole surroundings, he adds, "All this is very surprising when it is considered that 5 years ago nothing but the fern flourished here. Moreover, native workmanship taught by these missionaries has effected this change. The lesson of the missionary is the enchanter's wand. The house had been built, the windows framed, the fields plowed, and even the trees grafted by the New Zealander. When I looked at the whole scene, it was admirable. It was not that England was brought vividly before my mind, nor was it the triumphant feeling at seeing what Englishmen could effect, but rather the high hopes thus inspired for the future progress of this fine island." No such feeling was inspired by the conditions surrounding the Roman Catholic missionaries whom he met from time to time. In an earlier part of the Journal, he records an evening spent with one living in a lonely place in South America who, coming from Santiago, had contrived to surround himself with some few comforts. Being a man of some little education, he bitterly complained of the total want of society. With no particular zeal for religion, no business or pursuit, how completely must this man's life be wasted? In complete opposition to these views, passages occur in the following letters which show that Wallace thought more highly of the Roman Catholic than of the Protestant missionaries. In one place, speaking of the former, he says, "Most are Frenchmen, well-educated men who give up their lives for the good of the people they live among. I think Catholics and Protestants are equally wrong, but as missionaries, I think Catholics are the best, and I would gladly see none others rather than have, as in New Zealand, sects of native dissenters more rancorous against each other than in England. The unity of the Catholics is their strength, and an unmarried clergy can do as missionaries what married men never can undertake. As a sidelight on these contradictory estimates of the same works, it should be borne in mind that Darwin had but recently given up the idea of becoming a clergyman, and doubtless retained some of the instinctive regard for sincere Christian Protestantism, whether represented by the Church of England or by nonconformists, while Wallace had long since relinquished all doctrinal ideas on religion and all belief in the beneficial effect produced by forms of worship on the individual. Among the regions Wallace visited was Sarawak. Of one of his sojourns here some interesting reminiscences have been sent to me by Mr. L.V. Helms. He says, "It was in 1854 that Wallace came to Sarawak. It was there then sent by a private firm which later became the Borneo Company to open up by mining, manufacture, and trade the resources of the country, and amongst these enterprises was coal mining on the west. Wallace came in search of new specimens of animal and especially insect life. The clearing of ancient forests at these mines offered a naturalist great opportunities, and I gave Wallace an introduction to our engineer in charge there. His collections of beetles and butterflies there were phenomenal, but the district was also the special home of the great ape, the orangutan, or mias as the natives called them, of which he obtained so many valuable specimens. Many notes must at that time have passed between us, for I took much interest in his work. We had put up a temporary hut for him at the mines, and on my occasional visits there, I saw him and his young assistant, Charles Allen, at work, admired his beautiful collections, and gave my help in forwarding them. But it was mainly in social intercourse that we met, when Wallace, in intervals of his labors, came to Cochin and was the Rajah's guest. Then occurred those interesting discussions at social gatherings to which he refers in a letter to me in 1909 when he wrote, "I was pleased to receive your letter with reminiscences of old times. I often recall those pleasant evenings with Rajah Brooke and our little circle, but since the old Rajah's death, I have not met any of the party." Wallace was in Sarawak at the happy period in the country's history. It was beginning to emerge from barbarism. The Borneo Company was just formed, and the seed of the country's future prosperity was sown. Wallace, therefore, found us all sanguine and cheerful, yet we were on the brink of a disaster which brought many sorrows in its train. But the misfortunes of the Chinese revolt had not yet cast their shadows before them. The Rajah's white guests, round his hospitable table, the Malay chiefs and office holders who made evening calls from curiosity or to pay their respects, Dyaks squatting in dusky groups in corners of the hall, with petitions to make or advice to seek from their white ruler. Such would be the gathering of which Wallace would form a part. No suspicion or foreboding would trouble the company. Yet within a few months that hall would be given to the flames of an enemy's torch, and the Rajah himself and many of those who formed that company would be fugitives in the jungle. The Malay archipelago, in the unregenerated days when Wallace roamed the forest and sailed the straits in native boats and canoes, was full of danger to wanderers of the white race. Anarchy prevailed in many parts, usurping nobles enslaved the people in their houses, and piratical fleets scoured the sea, capturing and enslaving yearly thousands of peaceful traders, women, and children. The writer was himself in 1862 besieged in a Bornean river by a pirate fleet, which was eventually destroyed by a Sarawak government steamer, with the following result of the fight: 190 pirates and 140 captives were killed or drowned, and 250 of the latter were liberated and sent to their homes, showing how formidable these pirates were. But Wallace, absorbed in his scientific pursuits, minded not these dangers, nor the hardships of any kind which a roving life in untrodden jungles and feverish swamps brings. When Wallace left Sarawak after his 15 months' residence in the country, he left his young assistant Charles Allen there. He entered my service, and remained some time after the formation of the Borneo Company. Later he again joined Wallace and then went to New Guinea, doing valuable collecting and exploring work. He finally settled in Singapore, where I met him in 1899. He had married and was doing well, but died not long after my interview with him. He had come to the East with Wallace as a lad of 16, and had been his faithful companion and assistant during years of arduous work. The 8 years spent by Wallace in this almost unknown part of the world were times of strenuous mental and physical exertion, resulting in the gathering together of an enormous amount of matter for future scientific investigation, but counterbalanced, unfortunately, by more or less continuous ill health, which at times made the effort of clear reasoning and close application to scientific pursuits extremely difficult. An indication of the unwearying application with which he went about his task is seen in the fact that during this period he collected 125,660 specimens of natural history, traveled about 14,000 miles within the archipelago, and made 60 or 70 journeys, each involving some preparation and loss of time, so that not more than 6 years were really occupied in collecting. A faint idea of this long and solitary sojourn in lonely places is given in a letter to his old friend Bates, dated December 24, 1860, in which he says, "Many thanks for your long and interesting letter. I have myself suffered much in the same way as you describe, and I think more severely. The kind of tedium vitae you mention I also occasionally experience here. I impute it to a too monotonous existence, and again when he begs his friend to write, as he is half froze for news." As already stated, Wallace at no time during these wanderings had any escort or protection, having to rely entirely upon his own tact and patience, combined with firmness in his dealings with the natives. On one occasion he was taken ill, and had to remain 6 weeks with none but native Papuans around him, and he became so attached to them that when saying goodbye it was with the full intention of returning amongst them at a later period. In another place he speaks of sleeping under cover of an open palm leaf hut, as calmly as under the protection of the metropolitan police. Up to that time also he was the only Englishman who had actually seen the beautiful birds of paradise in their native forests. This success being achieved after 5 voyages to different parts of the district they inhabit, each occupying in its preparation and execution the larger part of a year. And then only 5 species out of a possible 14 were procured. His enthusiasm as a naturalist and collector knew no bounds, butterflies especially calling into play all his feelings of joy and satisfaction. Describing his first sight of the Ornithoptera croesus, he says that the blood rushed to his head, and he felt much more like fainting than he had done when in apprehension of immediate death. A similar sensation being experienced when he came across another large bird-winged butterfly, Ornithoptera Poseidon. It is one thing, he says, to see such beauty in a cabinet, and quite another to feel it struggling between one's fingers, and to gaze upon its fresh and living beauty, a bright green gem shining out amid the silent gloom of a dark and tangled forest. The village of Dobo held that evening at least one contented man. These thrills of joy may be considered as some compensation for such experiences as those contained in his graphic account of a single journey in a pro or native boat. "My first crew," he wrote, "ran away. 2 men were lost for a month on a desert island. We were 10 times aground on coral reefs. We lost 4 anchors. Our sails were devoured by rats. The small boat was lost astern. We were 38 days on the voyage home, which should have taken 12. We were many times short of food and water. We had no compass lamp, owing to there not being a drop of oil in Waggio when we left. And to crown it all, during the whole of our voyage, occupying in all 78 days, all in what was supposed to be the favorable season, we had not one single day of fair wind." The scientific discoveries arising out of these 8 years of laborious work and physical hardship were first, with the exception of the memorable essay on natural selection, included in his books on the Malay Archipelago, the geographical distribution of animals, island life, and Australasia, besides a number of papers contributed to various scientific journals. A bare catalogue of the places visited and explored includes Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Celebes, the Moluccas, Timor, New Guinea, the Aru and K Islands. Comparing this list with that given by Darwin at the close of the journal, we find that though in some respects the ground covered by the two men was similar, it never actually overlapped. The countries and islands visited by the Beagle came in the following order: Cape de Verde Islands, St. Paul's Rocks, Fernando Noronha, South America, including the Galapagos Archipelago, the Falkland Isles, and Tierra del Fuego, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, Keeling Island, Maldive Coral Atolls, Mauritius, St. Helena, Ascension. Brazil was revisited for a short time, and the Beagle touched at the Cape de Verde Islands and the Azores on the homeward voyage. The very nature of this voyage did not permit Darwin to give unlimited time to the study of any particular spot or locality. But his accurate observation of every detail, together with his carefully kept journal, afforded ample scope and foundation for future contemplation. To Wallace, the outstanding result may be summed up in the fact that he discovered that the Malay archipelago is divided into a western group of islands, which in their zoological affinities are Asiatic, and an eastern, which are Australian. The Oriental Borneo and Bali are respectively divided from the Australian Celebes and Lombok by a narrow belt of sea known as Wallace's Line, on the opposite side of which the indigenous mammalia are as widely divergent as in any two parts of the world. To both men, Darwin's estimate of the influence of travel may aptly apply in the case that from a geographical point of view, the map of the world ceases to be a blank. Each part assumes its proper dimensions. Continents are no longer considered islands, nor islands as mere specks. Wallace's homeward journey was not so eventful as the previous one had been, except for the unsuccessful efforts to bring back several species of live birds, which, with the exception of his birds of paradise, died on the way. On reaching London in the spring of 1862, he again made his home with his married sister, Mrs. Sims, who was living in Westbourne Grove. In a large empty room at the top of the house, he found himself surrounded with packing cases, which he had not seen for 5 or 6 years, and which, together with his recent collections, absorbed his time and interest for the first few weeks. Later he settled down to his literary work, and with the exception of 1 or 2 visits to the continent and America, spent the remainder of his life in England, a life full of activity, the results of which still permeate scientific research. Section 8. The Origin of the Moral and Intellectual Nature of Man, by Alfred Russel Wallace. Editor's Note: the following section, excerpted from Wallace's large volume, Darwinism, 1889, outlines where Wallace departs company with Charles Darwin over how far natural selection extends. Wallace argues that the mind and soul of man cannot be the product of blind natural forces. Continuing. From the foregoing discussion, it will be seen that I fully accept Mr. Darwin's conclusion as to the essential identity of man's bodily structure with that of the higher mammalia, and his descent from some ancestral form common to man and the anthropoid apes. The evidence of such descent appears to me to be overwhelming and conclusive. Again, as to the cause and method of such descent and modification, we may admit at all events provisionally that the laws of variation and natural selection, acting through the struggle for existence and the continual need of more perfect adaptation to the physical and biological environments, may have brought about, first, that perfection of bodily structure in which he is so far above all other animals, and in coordination with it the larger and more developed brain, by means of which he has been able to utilize that structure in the more and more complete subjection of the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms to his service. But this is only the beginning of Mr. Darwin's work, since he goes on to discuss the moral nature and mental faculties of man, and derives these too by gradual modification and development from the lower animals. Although perhaps nowhere distinctly formulated, his whole argument tends to the conclusion that man's entire nature, and all his faculties, whether moral, intellectual, or spiritual, have been derived from their rudiments in the lower animals, in the same manner and by the action of the same general laws as his physical structure has been derived. As this conclusion appears to me not to be supported by adequate evidence, and to be directly opposed to many well-ascertained facts, I propose to devote a brief space to its discussion. The argument from continuity. Mr. Darwin's mode of argument consists in showing that the rudiments of most, if not of all, the mental and moral faculties of man can be detected in some animals. The manifestations of intelligence, amounting in some cases to distinct acts of reasoning, in many animals are adduced as exhibiting in a much less degree the intelligence and reason of man. Instances of curiosity, imitation, attention, wonder, and memory are given, while examples are also adduced which may be interpreted as proving that animals exhibit kindness to their fellows, or manifest pride, contempt, and shame. Some are said to have the rudiments of language, because they utter several different sounds, each of which has a definite meaning to their fellows, or to their young. Others the rudiments of arithmetic, because they seem to count and remember up to 3, 4, or even 5. A sense of beauty is imputed to them on account of their own bright colors or the use of colored objects in their nests. While dogs, cats, and horses are said to have imagination, because they appear to be disturbed by dreams, even some distant approach to the rudiments of religion is said to be found in the deep love and complete submission of a dog to his master. Turning from animals to man, it is shown that in the lowest savages many of these faculties are very little advanced from the condition in which they appear in the higher animals, while others, although fairly well exhibited, are yet greatly inferior to the point of development they have reached in civilized races. In particular, the moral sense is said to have been developed from the social instincts of savages, and to depend mainly on the enduring discomfort produced by any action which excites the general disapproval of the tribe. Thus, every act of an individual, which is believed to be contrary to the interests of the tribe, excites its unvarying disapprobation and is held to be immoral, while every act, on the other hand, which is, as a rule, beneficial to the tribe, is warmly and constantly approved, and is thus considered to be right or moral. From the mental struggle, when an act that would benefit self is injurious to the tribe, there arises conscience, and thus the social instincts are the foundation of the moral sense and of the fundamental principles of morality. The question of the origin and nature of the moral sense and of conscience is far too vast and complex to be discussed here, and a reference to it has been introduced only to complete the sketch of Mr. Darwin's view of the continuity and gradual development of all human faculties from the lower animals up to savages, and from savage up to civilized man. The point to which I wish specially to call attention is that to prove continuity and the progressive development of the intellectual and moral faculties from animals to man is not the same as proving that these faculties have been developed by natural selection. And this last is what Mr. Darwin has heartily attempted, although to support his theory it was absolutely essential to prove it. Because man's physical structure has been developed from an animal form by natural selection, it does not necessarily follow that his mental nature, even though developed pari passu with it, has been developed by the same causes only. To illustrate by a physical analogy, upheaval and depression of land combined with subaerial denudation by wind and frost, rain and rivers, and marine denudation on coastlines were long thought to account for all the modeling of the earth's surface not directly due to volcanic action. And in the early editions of Lyell's Principles of Geology, these are the sole causes appealed to. But when the action of glaciers was studied, and the recent occurrence of a glacial epoch demonstrated as a fact many phenomena such as moraines and other gravel deposits, boulder clay, erratic boulders, grooved and rounded rocks, and alpine lake basins, were seen to be due to this altogether distinct cause. There was no breach of continuity, no sudden catastrophe. The cold period came on and passed away in the most gradual manner. and its effects often passed insensibly into those produced by denudation or upheaval. Yet nonetheless a new agency appeared at a definite time, and new effects were produced, which, though continuous with preceding effects, were not due to the same causes. It is not therefore to be assumed without proof or against independent evidence that the later stages of an apparently continuous development are necessarily due to the same causes only as the earlier stages. Applying this argument to the case of man's intellectual and moral nature, I propose to show that certain definite portions of it could not have been developed by variation and natural selection alone, and that therefore some other influence, law, or agency is required to account for them. If this can be clearly shown for any one or more of the special faculties of intellectual man, we shall be justified in assuming that the same unknown cause or power may have had a much wider influence, and may have profoundly influenced the whole course of his development. The origin of the mathematical faculty. We have ample evidence that in all the lower races of man, what may be termed the mathematical faculty is either absent, or if present, quite unexercised. The Bushmen and the Brazilian wood Indians are said not to count beyond 2. Many Australian tribes only have words for 1 and 2, which are combined to make 3, 4, 5, or 6, beyond which they do not count. The Damaras of South Africa only count to 3, and Mr. Galton gives us a curious description of how one of them was hopelessly puzzled when he had sold 2 sheep for 2 sticks of tobacco each, and received 4 sticks in payment. He could only find out that he was correctly paid by taking 2 sticks, and then giving 1 sheep, then receiving 2 sticks more and giving the other sheep. Even the comparatively intellectual Zulus can only count up to 10 by using the hands and fingers. The Ots of Northwest America count in nearly the same manner, and most of the tribes of South America are no further advanced. The Kaffirs have great herds of cattle, and if one is lost they miss it immediately. But this is not by counting, but by noticing the absence of one they know, just as in a large family or a school a boy is missed without going through the process of counting. Somewhat higher races, as the Eskimo, can count up to 20 by using the hands and the feet, and other races get even further than this by saying 1 man for 20, 2 men for 40, and so on, equivalent to our rural mode of reckoning by scores. From the fact that so many of the existing savage races can only count to 4 or 5, Sir John Lubbock thinks it improbable that our earliest ancestors could have counted as high as 10. When we turn to the more civilized races, we find the use of numbers and the art of counting greatly extended. Even the Tongas of the South Sea Islands are said to have been able to count as high as 100,000. But mere counting does not imply either the possession or the use of anything that can be really called the mathematical faculty, the exercise of which in any broad sense has only been possible since the introduction of the decimal notation. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Jews, and the Chinese had all such cumbrous systems that anything like a science of arithmetic beyond very simple operations was impossible, and the Roman system by which the year 1888 would be written MDCCCL XXXVIII was that in common use in Europe down to the 14th or 15th centuries, and even much later in some places. Algebra, which was invented by the Hindus, from whom also came the decimal notation, was not introduced into Europe till the 13th century, although the Greeks had some acquaintance with it, and it reached Western Europe from Italy only in the 16th century. It was no doubt owing to the absence of a sound system of numeration that the mathematical talent of the Greeks was directed chiefly to geometry, in which science Euclid, Archimedes, and others made such brilliant discoveries. It is, however, during the last 3 centuries only that the civilized world appears to have become conscious of the possession of a marvelous faculty which, when supplied with the necessary tools in the decimal notation, the elements of algebra and geometry, and the power of rapidly communicating discoveries and ideas by the art of printing, has developed to an extent the full grandeur of which can be appreciated only by those who have devoted some time, even if unsuccessfully, to the study. The facts now set forth as to the almost total absence of mathematical faculty in savages and its wonderful development in quite recent times are exceedingly suggestive, and in regard to them we are limited to two possible theories. Either prehistoric and savage man did not possess this faculty at all, or only in its merest rudiments, or they did possess it but had neither the means nor the incitements for its exercise. In the former case, we have to ask by what means has this faculty been so rapidly developed in all civilized races, many of which a few centuries back were, in this respect, almost savages themselves, while in the latter case the difficulty is still greater, for we have to assume the existence of a faculty which had never been used either by the supposed possessors of it or by their ancestors. Let us take then the least difficult supposition, that savages possessed only the mere rudiments of the faculty, such as their ability to count sometimes up to 10, but with an utter inability to perform the very simplest processes of arithmetic or of geometry, and inquire how this rudimentary faculty became rapidly developed into that of a Newton, a Laplace, a Gauss, or a Cayley. We will admit that there is every possible gradation between these extremes, and that there has been perfect continuity in the development of the faculty, but we ask, what motive power caused its development? It must be remembered we are here dealing solely with the capability of the Darwinian theory to account for the origin of the mind, as well as it accounts for the origin of the body of man. And we must therefore recall the essential features of that theory. These are the preservation of useful variations in the struggle for life, that no creature can be improved beyond its necessities for the time being, that the law acts by life and death, and by the survival of the fittest. We have to ask, therefore, what relation the successive stages of improvement of the mathematical faculty had to the life or death of its possessors, to the struggles of tribe with tribe or nation with nation, or to the ultimate survival of one race and the extinction of another. If it cannot possibly have had any such effects, then it cannot have been produced by natural selection. It is evident that in the struggles of savage man with the elements and with wild beasts, or of tribe with tribe, this faculty can have had no influence. It had nothing to do with the early migrations of man, or with the conquest and extermination of weaker by more powerful peoples. The Greeks did not successfully resist the Persian invaders by any aid from their few mathematicians, but by military training, patriotism, and self-sacrifice. The barbarous conquerors of the East, Tamerlane and Genghis Khan, did not owe their success to any superiority of intellect or of mathematical faculty in themselves or their followers. Even if the great conquests of the Romans were in part due to their systematic military organization, and to their skill in making roads and encampments, which may perhaps be imputed to some exercise of the mathematical faculty, that did not prevent them from being conquered in turn by barbarians, in whom it was almost entirely absent. And if we take the most civilized peoples of the ancient world, the Hindus, the Arabs, the Greeks, and the Romans, all of whom had some amount of mathematical talent, we find that it is not these, but the descendants of the barbarians of those days, the Celts, the Teutons, and the Slavs, who have proved themselves the fittest to survive in the great struggle of races, although we cannot trace their steadily growing success during past centuries, either to the possession of any exceptional mathematical faculty or to its exercise. They have indeed proved themselves today to be possessed of a marvelous endowment of the mathematical faculty, but their success at home and abroad, as colonists or as conquerors, as individuals or as nations, can in no way be traced to this faculty, since they were almost the last who devoted themselves to its exercise. We conclude, then, that the present gigantic development of the mathematical faculty is wholly unexplained by the theory of natural selection, and must be due to some altogether distinct cause. The origin of the musical and artistic faculties. These distinctively human faculties follow very closely the lines of the mathematical faculty in their progressive development, and serve to enforce the same argument. Among the lower savages, music, as we understand it, hardly exists, though they all delight in rude musical sounds, as of drums, tom-toms, or gongs, and they also sing in monotonous chants. Almost exactly as they advance in general intellect and in the arts of social life, their appreciation of music appears to rise in proportion, and we find among them rude stringed instruments and whistles, till in Java we have regular bands of skilled performers, probably the successors of Hindu musicians of the age before the Mohammedan conquest. The Egyptians are believed to have been the earliest musicians, and from them the Jews and the Greeks no doubt derived their knowledge of the art. But it seems to be admitted that neither the latter nor the Romans knew anything of harmony or of the essential features of modern music. Till the 15th century little progress appears to have been made in the science or the practice of music. But since that era it has advanced with marvelous rapidity, its progress being curiously parallel with that of mathematics, insomuch as great musical geniuses appeared suddenly among different nations, equal in their possession of this special faculty to any that have since arisen. As with the mathematical, so with the musical faculty, it is impossible to trace any connection between its possession and survival in the struggle for existence. It seems to have arisen as a result of social and intellectual advancement, not as a cause, and there is some evidence that it is latent in the lower races, since under European training native military bands have been formed in many parts of the world, which have been able to perform creditably the best modern music. The artistic faculty has run a somewhat different course, though analogous to that of the faculties already discussed. Most savages exhibit some rudiments of it, either in drawing or carving human or animal figures, but almost without exception these figures are rude and such as would be executed by the ordinary inartistic child. In fact, modern savages are in this respect hardly equal to those prehistoric men who represented the mammoth and the reindeer on pieces of horn or bone. With any advance in the arts of social life, we have a corresponding advance in artistic skill and taste, rising very high in the art of Japan and India, but culminating in the marvelous sculpture of the best period of Grecian history. In the Middle Ages, art was chiefly manifested in ecclesiastical architecture and the illumination of manuscripts. But from the 13th to the 15th centuries, pictorial art revived in Italy and attained to a degree of perfection which has never been surpassed. This revival was followed closely by the schools of Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, France, and England, showing that the true artistic faculty belonged to no one nation, but was fairly distributed among the various European races. These several developments of the artistic faculty, whether manifested in sculpture, painting, or architecture, are evidently outgrowths of the human intellect, which have no immediate influence on the survival of individuals or of tribes, or on the success of nations in their struggles for supremacy or for existence. The glorious art of Greece did not prevent the nation from falling under the sway of the less advanced Roman, while we ourselves, among whom art was the latest to arise, have taken the lead in the colonization of the world, thus proving our mixed race to be the fittest to survive. Independent proof that the mathematical, musical, and artistic faculties have not been developed under the law of natural selection. The law of natural selection, or the survival of the fittest, is, as its name implies, a rigid law which acts by the life or death of the individual submitted to its action. From its very nature, it can act only on useful or hurtful characteristics, eliminating the latter and keeping up the former to a fairly general level of efficiency. Hence it necessarily follows that the characters developed by its means will be present in all the individuals of a species, and, though varying, will not vary very widely from a common standard. The amount of variation we found in our third chapter to be about 1/5 or 1/6 of the mean value, that is, if the mean value were taken at 100, the variations would reach from 80 to 120, or somewhat more, if very large numbers were compared. In accordance with this law, we find that all those characters in man which were certainly essential to him during his early stages of development, exist in all savages with some approach to equality, in the speed of running and bodily strength, in skill with weapons, in acuteness of vision, or in power of following a trail. All are fairly proficient. And the differences of endowment do not probably exceed the limits of variation in animals above referred to. So, in animal instinct or intelligence, we find the same general level of development. Every wren makes a fairly good nest like its fellows. Every fox has an average amount of the sagacity of its race, while all the higher birds and mammals have the necessary affections and instincts needful for the protection and bringing up of their offspring. But in those specially developed faculties of civilized man, which we have been considering, the case is very different. They exist only in a small proportion of individuals, while the difference of capacity between these favored individuals and the average of mankind is enormous. Taking first the mathematical faculty, probably fewer than 1 in 100 really possess it, the great bulk of the population having no natural ability for the study, or feeling the slightest interest in it. And if we attempt to measure the amount of variation in the faculty itself between a first-class mathematician and the ordinary run of people, who find any kind of calculation confusing and altogether devoid of interest, it is probable that the former could not be estimated at less than 100 times the latter, and perhaps 1,000 times would more nearly measure the difference between them. The artistic faculty appears to agree pretty closely with the mathematical in its frequency. The boys and girls who, going beyond the mere conventional designs of children, draw what they see, not what they know to be the shape of things, who naturally sketch in perspective, because it is thus they see objects, who see and represent in their sketches the light and shade as well as the mere outlines of objects, and who can draw recognizable sketches of everyone they know, are certainly very few compared with those who are totally incapable of anything of the kind. From some inquiries I have made in schools and from my own observation, I believe that those who are endowed with this natural artistic talent do not exceed, even if they come up to, 1% of the whole population. The variations in the amount of artistic faculty are certainly very great, even if we do not take the extremes. The gradations of power between the ordinary man or woman who does not draw, and whose attempts at representing any object, animate or inanimate, would be laughable, and the average good artist who with a few bold strokes can produce a recognizable and even effective sketch of a landscape, a street, or an animal, are very numerous, and we can hardly measure the difference between them at less than 50 or 100-fold. The musical faculty is undoubtedly in its lower forms less uncommon than either of the preceding, but it still differs essentially from the necessary or useful faculties in that it is almost entirely wanting in 1/2 even of civilized men. For every person who draws, as it were instinctively, there are probably 5 or 10 who sing or play without having been taught and from mere innate love and perception of melody and harmony. On the other hand, there are probably about as many who seem absolutely deficient in musical perception, who take little pleasure in it, who cannot perceive discords or remember tunes, and who could not learn to sing or play with any amount of study. The gradations, too, are here quite as great as in mathematics or pictorial art, and the special faculty of the great musical composer must be reckoned many hundreds or perhaps thousands of times greater than that of the ordinary unmusical person above referred to. It appears, then, that both on account of the limited number of persons gifted with the mathematical, the artistic, or the musical faculty, as well as from the enormous variations in its development, these mental powers differ widely from those which are essential to man and are, for the most part, common to him and the lower animals, and that they could not, therefore, possibly have been developed in him by means of the law of natural selection. We have thus shown by 2 distinct lines of argument that faculties are developed in civilized man, which both in their mode of origin, their function, and their variations, are altogether distinct from those other characters and faculties which are essential to him, and which have been brought to their actual state of efficiency by the necessities of his existence. And besides the 3 which have been specifically referred to, there are others which evidently belong to the same class, such as the metaphysical faculty, which enables us to form abstract conceptions of a kind the most remote from all practical applications, to discuss the ultimate causes of things, the nature and qualities of matter, motion, and force, of space and time, of cause and effect, of will and conscience. Speculations on these abstract and difficult questions are impossible to savages, who seem to have no mental faculty enabling them to grasp the essential ideas or conceptions. Yet whenever any race attains to civilization and comprises a body of people who, whether as priests or philosophers, are relieved from the necessity of labor or of taking an active part in war or government, the metaphysical faculty appears to spring suddenly into existence, although, like the other faculties we have referred to, it is always confined to a very limited proportion of the population. In the same class we may place the peculiar faculty of wit and humor, an altogether natural gift, whose development appears to be parallel with that of the other exceptional faculties. Like them, it is almost unknown among savages, but appears more or less frequently as civilization advances and the interests of life become more numerous and more complex. Like them, too, it is altogether removed from utility in the struggle for life, and appears sporadically in a very small percentage of the population, the majority being, as is well known, totally unable to say a witty thing or make a pun, even to save their lives. The interpretation of the facts. The facts now set forth prove the existence of a number of mental faculties which either do not exist at all or exist in a very rudimentary condition in savages, but appear almost suddenly and in perfect development in the higher civilized races. These same faculties are further distinguished by their sporadic character, being well developed only in a very small proportion of the community, and by the enormous amount of variation in their development, the higher manifestations of them being many times, perhaps 100 or 1,000 times stronger than the lower. Each of these characteristics is totally inconsistent with any action of the law of natural selection in the production of the faculties referred to, and the facts taken in their entirety compel us to recognize some origin for them wholly distinct from that which has served to account for the animal characteristics, whether bodily or mental, of man. The special faculties we have been discussing clearly point to the existence in man something which he has not derived from his animal progenitors, something which we may best refer to as being of a spiritual essence or nature, capable of progressive development under favorable conditions. On the hypothesis of this spiritual nature, superadded to the animal nature of man, we are able to understand much that is otherwise mysterious or unintelligible in regard to him, especially the enormous influence of ideas, principles, and beliefs over his whole life and actions. Thus alone we can understand the constancy of the martyr, the unselfishness of the philanthropist, the devotion of the patriot, the enthusiasm of the artist, and the resolute and persevering search of the scientific worker after nature's secrets. Thus we may perceive that the love of truth, the delight in beauty, the passion for justice, and the thrill of exultation with which we hear of any act of courageous self-sacrifice are the workings within us of a higher nature, which has not been developed by means of the struggle for material existence. It will no doubt be urged that the admitted continuity of man's progress from the brute does not admit of the introduction of new causes, and that we have no evidence of the sudden change of nature which such introduction would bring about. The fallacy as to new causes involving any breach of continuity, or any sudden or abrupt change in the effects, has already been shown, but we will further point out that there are at least 3 stages in the development of the organic world when some new cause or power must necessarily have come into action. The first stage is the change from inorganic to organic, when the earliest vegetable cell or the living protoplasm out of which it arose first appeared. This is often imputed to a mere increase of complexity of chemical compounds, but increase of complexity, with consequent instability, even if we admit that it may have produced protoplasm as a chemical compound, could certainly not have produced living protoplasm which has the power of growth and of reproduction, and of that continuous process of development which has resulted in the marvelous variety and complex organization of the whole vegetable kingdom. There is in all this something quite beyond and apart from chemical changes, however complex, and it has been well said that the first vegetable cell was a new thing in the world, possessing altogether new powers, that of extracting and fixing carbon from the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, that of indefinite reproduction, and still more marvelous, the power of variation, and of reproducing those variations till endless complications of structure and varieties of form have been the result. Here then we have indications of a new power at work, which we may term vitality, since it gives to certain forms of matter all those characters and properties which constitute life. The next stage is still more marvelous, still more completely beyond all possibility of explanation by matter, its laws and forces. It is the introduction of sensation or consciousness, constituting the fundamental distinction between the animal and vegetable kingdoms. Here all idea of mere complication of structure producing the result is out of the question. We feel it to be altogether preposterous to assume that at a certain stage of complexity of atomic constitution and as a necessary result of that complexity alone, an ego should start into existence, a thing that feels, that is conscious of its own existence. Here we have the certainty that something new has arisen, a being whose nascent consciousness has gone on increasing in power and definiteness, till it has culminated in the higher animals. No verbal explanation or attempt at explanation, such as the statement that life is the result of the molecular forces of the protoplasm, or that the whole existing organic universe from the amoeba up to man was latent in the fire mist from which the solar system was developed, can afford any mental satisfaction or help us in any way to a solution of the mystery. The third stage is, as we have seen, the existence in man of a number of his most characteristic and noblest faculties, those which raise him furthest above the brutes and open up possibilities of almost indefinite advancement. These faculties could not possibly have been developed by means of the same laws which have determined the progressive development of the organic world in general, and also of man's physical organism. These three distinct stages of progress from the inorganic world of matter and motion up to man point clearly to an unseen universe, to a world of spirit, to which the world of matter is altogether subordinate. To this spiritual world we may refer the marvelously complex forces which we know as gravitation, cohesion, chemical force, radiant force, and electricity, without which the material universe could not exist for a moment in its present form, and perhaps not at all, since without these forces and perhaps others which may be termed atomic, it is doubtful whether matter itself could have any existence. And still more surely can we refer to it those progressive manifestations of life in the vegetable, the animal, and man, which we may classify as unconscious, conscious, and intellectual life, and which probably depend upon different degrees of spiritual influx. I have already shown that this involves no necessary infraction of the law of continuity in physical or mental evolution, whence it follows that any difficulty we may find in discriminating the inorganic from the organic, the lower vegetable from the lower animal organisms, or the higher animals from the lowest types of man, has no bearing at all upon the question. This is to be decided by showing that a change in essential nature, due probably to causes of a higher order than those of the material universe, took place at the several stages of progress which I have indicated. A change which may be none the less real because absolutely imperceptible at its point of origin, as is the change that takes place in the curve in which a body is moving when the application of some new force causes the curve to be slightly altered. Concluding remarks. Those who admit my interpretation of the evidence now adduced, strictly scientific evidence in its appeal to facts which are clearly what ought not to be on the materialistic theory, will be able to accept the spiritual nature of man as not in any way inconsistent with the theory of evolution, but as dependent on those fundamental laws and causes which furnish the very materials for evolution to work with. They will also be relieved from the crushing mental burthen imposed upon those who maintaining that we, in common with the rest of nature, are but products of the blind eternal forces of the universe, and believing also that the time must come when the sun will lose his heat and all life on the earth necessarily cease, have to contemplate a not very distant future in which all this glorious earth, which for untold millions of years has been slowly developing forms of life and beauty to culminate at last in man, shall be as if it had never existed, who are compelled to suppose that all the slow growths of our race struggling towards a higher life, all the agony of martyrs, all the groans of victims, all the evil and misery and undeserved suffering of the ages, all the struggles for freedom, all the efforts towards justice, all the aspirations for virtue and the well-being of humanity, shall absolutely vanish, and like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a rack behind. As contrasted with this hopeless and soul-deadening belief, we who accept the existence of a spiritual world can look upon the universe as a grand, consistent whole, adapted in all of its parts to the development of spiritual beings capable of indefinite life and perfectibility. To us, the whole purpose, the only raison d'etre of the world, with all its complexities of physical structure, with its grand geological progress, the slow evolution of the vegetable and animal kingdoms, and the ultimate appearance of man, was the development of the human spirit in association with the human body. From the fact that the spirit of man, the man himself, is so developed, we may well believe that this is the only, or at least the best way for its development, and we may even see in what is usually termed evil on the earth one of the most efficient means of its growth. For we know that the noblest faculties of man are strengthened and perfected by struggle and effort. It is by unceasing warfare against physical evils, and in the midst of difficulty and danger, that energy, courage, self-reliance, and industry have become the common qualities of the northern races. It is by the battle with moral evil in all its hydra-headed forms that the still nobler qualities of justice and mercy and humanity and self-sacrifice have been steadily increasing in the world. Beings thus trained and strengthened by their surroundings, and possessing latent faculties capable of such noble development, are surely destined for a higher and more permanent existence, and we may confidently believe, with our greatest living poet, that life is not as idle ore, but iron dug from central gloom, and heated hot with burning fears, and dipped in baths of hissing tears, and battered with the shocks of doom to shape and use. We thus find that the Darwinian theory, even when carried out to its extreme logical conclusion, not only does not oppose, but lends a decided support to, a belief in the spiritual nature of man. It shows us how man's body may have been developed from that of a lower animal form under the law of natural selection. But it also teaches us that we possess intellectual and moral faculties which could not have been so developed, but must have had another origin. And for this origin, we can only find an adequate cause in the unseen universe of spirit.